After my husband, a retired Army colonel, passed away, my mother-in-law stood in front of our entire congregation and announced she was taking the house, the family business, and everything he left behind. She gave me 30 days to vacate. My attorney urged me to fight her in court. I simply shook my head and said, "Let her have it." The entire courtroom thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every single document. She smiled like she had already won the ultimate victory. Then the judge closed the file. I looked directly at her high-priced attorney and asked one simple question that made the blood drain from their faces. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family member who tried to erase your worth. The air inside my home was thick with the scent of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and the heavy floral perfumes of the church mothers. It was the repast, the traditional gathering after we had just laid my husband Isaiah to rest. Isaiah was 42 years old, a decorated retired Army colonel, a man whose commanding presence filled a room and whose sudden heart attack had shattered my entire world. I am Jada, 34 years old, and I was standing near the kitchen island, gripping a porcelain plate so tightly my knuckles were turning white. My feet ached in my black heels, and my eyes were swollen from days of relentless crying. The house was packed with military brass in their crisp dress blues and our church family from First Zion. It was supposed to be a moment of shared grief, a time to honor a man who had served his country and his community. Instead, it became the battleground for my mother-in-law. Vivian stood at the head of my dining table. She was a woman who demanded submission, draped in an impeccably tailored black suit and a wide-brimmed mourning hat that cast a dark shadow over her sharp features. She had always viewed me as an interloper, a temporary distraction that her son would eventually outgrow. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it firmly against her crystal water glass. The sharp clinking sound cut through the low murmur of conversations, silencing the entire room within seconds. Even the commanding officers turned their attention to the matriarch of the family. I expected her to offer a prayer, perhaps share a fond memory of Isaiah growing up. Instead, she locked her piercing gaze directly on me. "Isaiah is gone," she declared, her voice projecting across the silent living room with chilling clarity. "And so is his charity. Jada, you have until the end of the month to vacate my son's house. I am taking back the keys and the family logistics business." The collective gasp from the room was audible. Pastor Williams, who had just delivered a beautiful eulogy an hour earlier, froze with a cup of coffee halfway to his mouth. Sister Thomas dropped her napkin onto the hardwood floor. The military men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging bewildered glances. It was the ultimate ambush calculated for maximum public humiliation. Vivian wanted to establish absolute dominance in front of our entire community, stripping me of my dignity, while my husband's grave was barely covered with earth. She was using the presence of our community as a weapon, banking on the cultural expectation that a younger woman would never dare disrespect an elder in front of the congregation. I set my plate down on the granite countertop. The ceramic made a loud thud in the dead quiet room. I did not burst into tears. I did not crumble under the weight of her cruelty. I squared my shoulders and walked slowly toward her, feeling the eyes of 50 people tracking my every move. "Your son's house?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Vivian, my name is on the deed." "My name is on the—" Vivian let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Please," she sneered, raising her voice so the folks in the back row could hear every venomous word. "You were a bankrupt 22-year-old college dropout working the reception desk when my decorated son saved you. He built Vanguard Logistics from his military pension, and you are just a gold digger trying to cash out. You never belonged in this family, and now that my son is not here to protect you, I am taking back everything that belongs to the legacy." She threw my past in my face like a grenade. Yes, I had dropped out of college a decade ago to pay off my sick mother's medical debts. Yes, I had worked reception when I first met Isaiah. But what Vivian conveniently omitted was that Vanguard Logistics did not even exist back then. Isaiah and I had built it together from scratch, working late nights in a cramped apartment, surviving on ramen noodles, while securing our first government contracts. I had sacrificed my own youth to help build the very empire she was now claiming as her exclusive family birthright. She wanted the church to see a helpless charity case deliberately ignoring the blood, sweat, and tears I poured into the very floorboards we were standing on. The room held its collective breath, waiting for a screaming match. They expected the grieving widow to lose her temper or fall to her knees and beg for mercy. But I remembered Isaiah's calm under pressure, the way he taught me to navigate hostile business negotiations. "You never let them see you sweat," he used to say. I reached into my black leather purse and pulled out my heavy keyring. The metal jingled sharply in the silent room. I walked right up to Vivian, holding her gaze, refusing to let her see a single ounce of intimidation. I dropped the keys right onto the mahogany table in front of her. They landed with a heavy final clatter. "Take them," I said, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the warm air in the room. "But you might want to check the locks before you start moving your furniture in." Without waiting for her response, I turned my back on her. I walked straight past the stunned church members, past the wide-eyed military officers, and out the front door of my own home. I left Vivian standing there, clutching my keys, looking momentarily confused, but fiercely victorious. She thought she had just won the war by bullying a grieving widow out of her own house. She had absolutely no idea that she had just triggered a trap that would completely destroy her. My name is Jada. I am 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago I buried my husband, a retired Army colonel, who was my entire world. While I was still picking out his casket, my mother-in-law was already plotting to seize our multi-million-dollar logistics company and throw me out of my own home. She dragged me into court, demanding every single asset he left behind. My attorney begged me to fight her. Instead, I looked the judge dead in the eye and signed over everything. My mother-in-law smiled like she had just won the lottery. She had no idea she had just swallowed a financial cyanide pill that would completely destroy her life. Before I dive into exactly how I orchestrated her absolute ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who severely underestimated your intelligence. The air inside my house was heavy, with the rich scents of baked macaroni and cheese-fried chicken, and the overwhelming floral perfumes of the church mothers from First Zion Baptist. It was the repast, the traditional gathering immediately following a funeral. Just hours earlier, we had lowered my husband Isaiah into the ground. He was only 42, a decorated military veteran whose sudden massive heart attack had shattered the foundation of my life. I was standing near the kitchen island, my feet aching in my black heels, gripping a porcelain plate so tightly my fingers were completely numb. My eyes burned from days of endless crying, and I was running on nothing but adrenaline and grief. The living room was packed shoulder to shoulder with Isaiah's former military colleagues in their crisp dress blues and our entire church congregation. It was supposed to be a sacred moment of shared mourning. Instead, it became a calculated execution. Vivian, my mother-in-law, positioned herself at the head of my mahogany dining table. She was a woman who demanded absolute submission, draped in an expensive, tailored black suit and a wide-brimmed mourning hat that cast a dark shadow over her face. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it firmly against her crystal water glass. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the low murmur of conversations, silencing the entire room within seconds. Even the highest-ranking military officers turned their attention to the family matriarch. I thought she was going to deliver a heartfelt tribute to her son. Instead, Vivian looked directly across the room at me, her eyes cold and merciless. "Isaiah is gone," she declared, her voice projecting across the silent space with chilling authority. "And so is his charity. Jada, you have until the end of the month to vacate my son's house. I am taking back the keys, and I'm taking full control of the family logistics business." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Pastor Williams, who had just delivered a beautiful eulogy an hour earlier, froze with a cup of coffee halfway to his mouth. Several church elders shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes creaking against the hardwood floor. Vivian had chosen this exact moment, surrounded by our entire community, to deliver a public eviction notice. She was banking on the cultural expectation that a younger woman would never dare disrespect an elder in front of the pastor and the congregation. She wanted me to cower. She wanted me to break down sobbing and validate her belief that I was nothing without her son. I set my plate down on the granite countertop. The ceramic made a loud thud in the dead quiet room. I did not cry. I did not crumble under the weight of her cruelty. I squared my shoulders and walked slowly toward her. "Your son's house?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. I stopped, just a few feet away from her. "Vivian, my name is on the deed." Vivian threw her head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She turned to face the crowd, playing to her audience like a seasoned politician. "Please," she scoffed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You were a bankrupt 22-year-old college dropout working a cheap reception desk when my decorated son saved you. He pulled you out of the gutter, Jada. He paid off your mother's medical debts and gave you a name that actually means something in this city." The sheer disrespect burned my throat. Vivian was doing what she did best, weaponizing my past to strip away my dignity. "My son built Vanguard Logistics from his hard-earned military pension while you played house." She continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "You are nothing but a gold digger trying to cash out on a dead hero's legacy. This house belongs to the family. The business belongs to the family. You are just a temporary mistake he never got around to fixing." The congregation did not know the truth. They only saw Isaiah, the handsome, charismatic military man. They had no idea that his security clearance had explicitly prohibited him from holding civilian commercial debt during our startup phase. They did not know about the nights I stayed awake until 4 in the morning, drafting the business plans, securing the commercial leases, and putting every single foundational loan squarely in my own name. I built the infrastructure of Vanguard Logistics while Isaiah was still finishing his final tour of duty. But Vivian was a master of rewriting history, painting me as a parasite who contributed nothing. Her younger son, Jamal, stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with his mother. He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest with unearned arrogance. "Mom is right," Jamal sneered. "Did you really think a firm serving the Department of Defense was going to be run by a woman who does not even have a degree? Isaiah put you on the letterhead to make you feel important, Jada. That is all it was. Mom holds the majority voting rights from his initial seed capital, and we are taking the reins starting tomorrow morning." I looked around the room. Not a single person stepped forward to defend me. The military men stared at the floor. The church ladies whispered behind their hands. My entire support system evaporated in the face of Vivian's aggressive takeover. I realized in that exact moment that this had been planned. While I was sitting by my husband's hospital bed praying for his recovery, his mother and brother had been calculating how to strip me of everything I owned. The coordinated attack was flawless. They had been counting his assets before his heart even stopped beating. The sheer disrespect of staging this coup during his repast with his body barely cold in the ground told me everything I needed to know about their grief. They were not mourning a son and a brother. They were securing a bag. My blood boiled with a rage so pure and concentrated it felt like ice in my veins. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to break my spirit and send me packing with nothing but the clothes on my back. They genuinely believed I was a weak, uneducated receptionist who had stumbled into wealth by marrying the right man. They had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. The pastor finally stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Now, sisters, this is a house of mourning. Let us seek peace and discuss these worldly matters at a more appropriate time." I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. I did not need peace, and I certainly did not need to argue with a woman who had already convicted me in her mind. I reached into my black leather purse and pulled out my heavy key ring. The metal jingled sharply in the tense silence. I walked right up to the dining table, maintaining unbroken eye contact with Vivian, and dropped my house keys directly onto the polished wood. They landed with a heavy final clatter. "Take them," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. Vivian blinked, momentarily confused by my sudden surrender. She had expected a screaming match. She had prepared for me to fight tooth and nail, making myself look like a hysterical, greedy widow. My quiet compliance threw her completely off balance. She reached out and snatched the keys off the table, a triumphant smirk quickly replacing her confusion. I grabbed my dark wool coat from the back of a nearby chair and slipped it on. I leaned in close to Vivian, lowering my voice so only she and Jamal could hear my next words. "But you might want to check the locks before you start moving your furniture in." I turned my back on them and walked straight toward the front door. The crowd parted for me automatically, their faces a blur of shock and morbid curiosity. I stepped out onto the front porch, the crisp evening air hitting my face, leaving behind the only home I had known for the last decade. I left Vivian standing there clutching my keys, absolutely certain she had just conquered my empire. She had no idea that walking out that door was the first step in a meticulously crafted strategy that would leave her bankrupt, humiliated, and begging for mercy. I walked down the brick pathway of my home, the cold evening air biting at my tear-stained cheeks. My heels clicked against the pavement in a sharp, steady rhythm that grounded me in the reality of what had just happened. Behind me, the heavy oak door of the house remained shut, but I could practically feel the chaotic energy vibrating through the walls. Vivian was undoubtedly holding court, spinning her narrative of the tragic mother rescuing her dead son's legacy from the clutches of a manipulative outsider. Let her talk. Let her bask in the applause of people who only knew how to follow the loudest voice in the room. I reached my car, a modest sedan I had bought with my own savings years ago, and slid into the driver's seat. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence of the cabin wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I gripped the steering wheel, resting my forehead against the cold leather. For 10 minutes, I allowed myself to feel the crushing weight of losing Isaiah all over again. He was my partner, my protector, the only person in that family who saw my brilliance and nourished it instead of fearing it. The tears came hot and fast, blurring the streetlights outside my windshield. But I did not have the luxury of falling apart. Isaiah had warned me about his mother's relentless greed. He knew she would come for the business the moment he could no longer stand between us. That was why we structured Vanguard Logistics the way we did. That was why I held the keys to a completely separate kingdom she knew nothing about. I wiped my face, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without a single backward glance. The house was just a building. The real empire lived in the contracts, the patents, and the commercial leases I had quietly secured under my own holding company. I did not sleep that night. I drove to a quiet downtown hotel, checked in under my maiden name, and spent the entire night sitting at a small desk, bathed in the glow of my laptop screen. I reviewed every single operating agreement, every warehouse lease, and the proprietary dispatch software patent that Vanguard Logistics relied on to function. Vivian thought the military contracts were the lifeblood of the company. She was completely oblivious to the fact that without the software and the physical warehouses, Vanguard Logistics was just a fancy name on a piece of paper. I printed out the secondary documents I needed and carefully placed them in my briefcase. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the city skyline in shades of bruised purple and dull orange, my tears had completely dried. Grief had been entirely replaced by cold, calculating determination. At 6 in the morning, I pulled into the underground parking garage of the Vanguard Logistics corporate office. The building was a sleek structure of glass and steel that Isaiah and I had proudly leased when our first major government contract cleared. I swiped my security badge, the green light flashing as the heavy glass doors slid open. The lobby was empty, smelling faintly of citrus cleaning supplies and expensive coffee. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull ache settling in my chest as the doors opened to the executive suite. Walking into Isaiah's corner office was like stepping into a vacuum. His favorite leather chair sat empty. The silver-framed photo of us on our wedding day still occupied the corner of his massive desk. The scent of his cedarwood cologne lingered in the air. For a split second, I wanted to curl up on the floor and surrender to the pain, but the soft ding of the elevator down the hall shattered the silence. Someone else was here. I quickly wiped my eyes and turned around just as the glass door to the suite swung open. It was Chloe. She was Jamal's wife, a woman who had married into the family 2 years ago and spent most of her time curating a picture-perfect lifestyle on social media, funded entirely by the salary Jamal drew from our company. Chloe stood in the doorway holding a cardboard moving box and 2 large coffees. She wore an expensive beige cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that probably took an hour to achieve. When she saw me standing by Isaiah's desk, her face immediately contorted into a mask of exaggerated sympathy. She set the box and the coffees down on a side table and rushed across the room, wrapping her arms around me in a tight, suffocating hug. I stood perfectly rigid, enduring the embrace, as the cloying scent of her expensive perfume filled my nose. Jada? I am so incredibly sorry, Chloe murmured, pulling back just enough to look at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. I could not believe what Vivian did yesterday at the repast. It was absolutely disgusting. She is toxic, Jada. You know I have always thought she was toxic. I came up here as soon as I could because I knew you would be hurting. I want to help you. I studied her face, noting the slight twitch in her jaw and the way her eyes darted nervously toward the large steel safe embedded in the wall behind Isaiah's desk. Chloe loved playing the innocent outsider, the sweet sister-in-law, who was just trying to keep the peace. But I knew exactly who she was. She was Jamal's eyes and ears sent here to ensure I did not walk away with anything valuable before the rest of the family arrived to stake their claim. Thank you, Chloe, I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly polite. That means a lot. It is going to be a long morning. Let me help you pack up Isaiah's personal things, she offered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You should not have to do this alone. Vivian and Jamal are meeting with the corporate lawyers at 9 and they are planning to change the security codes. We need to get your things out before they arrive and make a scene. I am entirely on your side, Jada. We can get the master contracts from the safe, put everything in my car, and figure out the rest later. I will protect your files from Vivian. I offered her a weak, grateful smile, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated widow she desperately needed me to be. The master contracts. That was what they were really after. They needed the original operating agreements to legally seize control of the company accounts. Chloe was not here to help me pack memories. She was here to secure the crown jewels before I could hide them. I nodded slowly, turning my back to her as I walked toward the wall safe, knowing perfectly well that the real war had just begun. I traced my fingers over the cold steel dial of the wall safe hidden behind Isaiah's framed military commendations. The combination is our wedding anniversary. I spin the dial, hearing the familiar heavy clicks echoing in the quiet office. I pull the heavy steel door open, expecting to see the thick manila folders containing the Vanguard Logistics primary operating agreements, the master commercial leases, and the proprietary software patents. Instead, my eyes adjust to the dark interior and find absolutely nothing. The metal shelves are completely bare. A cold rush of adrenaline hits my chest and I spin around. Chloe is no longer standing by the doorway, pretending to be a supportive shoulder to cry on. She has moved to the center of the room, and the cardboard moving box she brought is sitting on the glass coffee table. Poking out of the top of that box are the familiar edges of Isaiah's confidential corporate folders. Her face has completely transformed. The wide, tearful eyes and the sympathetic pout are gone. In their place is a sharp, calculating smirk that makes my stomach turn. She takes a slow sip of her coffee, watching my realization set in with absolute delight. You really should have changed the combination, Jada, she says, her voice completely dropping the sweet, high-pitched tone she usually uses around the family. Isaiah was a creature of habit. Using your anniversary was romantic, I suppose, but it was also incredibly predictable. Before I can take a single step toward her, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swing open again. Vivian marches in flanked by my brother-in-law, Jamal, and a tall, sharp-featured man carrying a dark leather briefcase. Vivian's eyes sweep the room, landing on the empty wall safe, then immediately shifting to the cardboard box in Chloe's possession. She smiles, a cold, predatory curving of her lips that sends a shiver down my spine. Right on time, Vivian announces, smoothing the lapels of her designer blazer. Chloe immediately picks up the thick stack of folders from her box and walks them directly over to Vivian. She hands them over like a loyal foot soldier, delivering captured enemy flags to her general. Jamal steps forward, his chest puffed out with unearned arrogance. He has never worked a single day in the logistics field. His entire career has consisted of bouncing between failed tech startups, all of them funded by Vivian's endless checkbook. Did you really think a firm serving the Department of Defense was going to be run by a woman who does not even have a college degree? Jamal sneers, his voice dripping with condescension. Isaiah put you on the letterhead to let you play house. He felt sorry for you. But Mom holds the majority voting rights from his initial seed capital, and we are restructuring the board effective immediately. You are officially locked out. I stand perfectly still, letting their arrogance fill the room. They had plotted this exact scenario while my husband was lying in a hospital bed attached to a ventilator. While I was holding his hand, praying for a miracle and negotiating with surgeons, they were digging through his office, stealing corporate documents, and staging a hostile takeover. The sheer scale of their betrayal takes my breath away. The lawyer steps up to Isaiah's desk, placing his briefcase on the polished wood. He snaps the latches open and pulls out a crisp, freshly printed contract. He pushes it across the desk toward me, placing a silver pen right beside it. This is a severance agreement, Mrs. Wilson, the lawyer, states in a flat, clinical tone. The family is prepared to offer you $50,000 to walk away quietly and relinquish any contested claims to Vanguard Logistics. If you refuse to sign this document today, my clients are prepared to freeze all of your personal bank accounts tied to the business payroll. You will be locked in aggressive litigation for a decade, and you will simply not have the capital to fight us. I look down at the document. $50,000 for a company generating millions in annual revenue. It is not just an insult. It is a deliberate attempt to erase my entire existence and starve me into submission. Vivian crosses her arms, practically vibrating with triumph. She looks at me like a pest she has finally managed to exterminate. Sign it, Jada. Vivian commands, her voice echoing in the large office. Take the money and go back to whatever cheap reception desk you crawled out from. You are done here. I reach out and pick up the silver pen. Chloe lets out a soft, mocking sigh of relief. Jamal smirks at his mother, clearly thinking they have broken me. I hover the pen over the signature line, feeling the heavy silence of the room pressing in on me. My hand moves toward the paper, but instead of signing my name, I shift my weight and purposefully drive my elbow directly into the large, full cup of scalding hot coffee Chloe had placed on the edge of the desk. The plastic lid pops off instantly upon impact. A dark, boiling wave of coffee washes directly over the original operating agreements, the stolen master contracts, and their ridiculous $50,000 severance agreement. The liquid pools and spreads in a matter of seconds, completely destroying the paperwork. Oops, I say, my voice ringing out clear and unapologetic as the hot coffee drips off the edge of the desk and splatters onto the lawyer's expensive Italian leather shoes. Guess you will have to print new ones. I drop the silver pen directly into the spreading brown puddle. Vivian's face turns a dangerous shade of purple with rage as she lunges forward to salvage the ruined documents, but it is entirely too late. The ink is already bleeding, the pages are dissolving, and the pristine contracts are reduced to soggy trash. I step carefully around the mess, adjusting my purse on my shoulder with perfect composure. See you in court, I tell them. I turn and walk out of the office, the sound of my heels masking the frantic scrambling and shouting behind me, leaving them in a panic over a kingdom they falsely believed they had conquered. I reached out and gripped the heavy gold frame of the abstract painting Isaiah had bought during our first anniversary trip to Chicago. I swung it gently on its hidden hinges, revealing the brushed steel face of the wall safe embedded deep into the reinforced masonry. The cold metal bit into my fingertips. Behind me, I could hear the faint rhythmic tapping of Chloe's designer fingernails against her coffee cup. She was practically vibrating with nervous energy, waiting for the exact moment the trap would spring closed. I played my part flawlessly. I took a deep, shaky breath, letting my shoulders slump just enough to project the image of a broken widow clinging to the last remnants of her husband's life. I raised my hand to the digital keypad. The combination was the date of our wedding. Isaiah was a brilliant strategist, but he was fiercely sentimental when it came to our marriage. He trusted his family implicitly, a fatal flaw that I was only now fully comprehending. I pressed the sequence of numbers. A sharp beep echoed through the quiet office, followed by the heavy mechanical thud of the internal locking bolts sliding back. I pulled the thick steel handle downward and hauled the heavy door open, preparing to grab the blue manila folders that held the primary operating agreements for Vanguard Logistics. The safe was empty. Not just empty, but completely gutted. The metal shelves, usually stacked with classified vendor contracts, corporate tax filings, and emergency cash reserves, were entirely stripped bare. A single layer of dust had been disturbed, showing the frantic sweeping motions of whoever had raided it. My stomach dropped, replaced instantly by a surge of pure icy adrenaline. They had not merely planned this takeover. They had executed it with the precision of a military strike while I was busy picking out a mahogany casket for my husband. I stood there staring into the dark, hollow cavity of the safe. For a split second, I allowed myself to genuinely feel the profound violation of the moment. This was Isaiah's private domain, his secure sanctuary, and his own blood had pillaged it before the dirt on his grave had even settled. I let out a soft, sharp breath, feigning total devastation. Then I turned around. Chloe was no longer hovering near the doorway, playing the role of the sympathetic sister-in-law. She had moved to the center of the executive suite, positioning herself between me and the exit. The transformation in her demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The wide, tearful eyes and the gentle, comforting pout vanished completely. Her posture straightened, her shoulders pulling back as she crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. A cold, calculating smirk slowly spread across her face, pulling her lips into a sharp line of pure malice. "You really should have advised him to change the combination, Jada," Chloe said. Her voice was stripped of all its previous warmth, replaced by a harsh, mocking tone that cut through the silence of the room like a blade. "Using your wedding anniversary was romantic, I suppose, but it was also incredibly predictable." Jamal figured it out on his first try. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, her eyes locked onto mine, savoring every second of my apparent shock. She was basking in the glory of the ambush, thrilled to be the one holding the knife. "You broke into his office," I said, keeping my voice low, letting a perfectly calibrated tremble bleed into my words. "You broke into his safe while he was dying." "We secured company assets," Chloe corrected swiftly, her smirk widening. "There is a very big difference. We could not let an uneducated receptionist walk away with millions of dollars just because she managed to secure a marriage certificate. Vivian was right about you from day one. You are nothing but a liability to this family." Before I could take a single step toward her, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open with a forceful whoosh. The timing was so perfectly choreographed, it felt like a scene from a stage play. Vivian marched into the room, flanked by Jamal and a tall, sharp-featured man carrying a dark leather briefcase. Vivian looked like she was arriving at a coronation. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her head held high, radiating absolute authority and unquestionable triumph. Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on the open, empty wall safe before locking onto me with a look of utter disgust. Jamal trailed a half step behind his mother, his chest puffed out with unearned arrogance. He had never worked a single day in the logistics field, having spent his entire adult life bouncing between failed tech startups funded entirely by Vivian's endless checkbook. Yet he swaggered into Isaiah's office as if he had built the empire with his own bare hands. He looked around the room, running his hand along the edge of the conference table, already mentally redecorating the space. The man beside them, the The corporate lawyer scanned the room with the dead, emotionless eyes of a predator assessing a wounded animal. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and stepped forward, placing his briefcase directly onto the center of Isaiah's polished desk. Right on schedule, Vivian announced, her voice booming through the spacious office. She stopped right beside her lawyer, claiming the territory as her own. Chloe immediately stepped forward. She reached into the large designer tote bag she had brought with her, completely abandoning the cardboard moving box she had used as a prop. With a triumphant flourish, she pulled out a thick stack of familiar blue manila folders. The Vanguard Logistics master contracts, the original operating agreements, the very documents they believed gave them absolute legal control over every single bank account, warehouse, and dispatch route in the company. Chloe walked directly over to Vivian, ignoring my presence entirely. She held up the missing folders like captured enemy flags and placed them gently into Vivian's waiting hands. "Here are the primary contracts," Vivian Chloe said, her voice dripping with subservient loyalty. "Just as you requested. Every single operating agreement is right here." Vivian took the folders, her fingers tracing the edges of the heavy cardstock. She looked down at the stolen documents, letting out a deep, satisfied sigh before turning her merciless gaze back to me. The trap had been fully sprung, the jaws snapping shut with brutal precision. They had cornered me in my own corporate headquarters, stripped me of what they believed was my legal leverage, and surrounded me with a hostile firing squad. They stood there, a united front of greed and entitlement, absolutely certain they had won the war, before I had even thrown a single punch. Vivian clutched the thick blue manila folders to her chest like a shield of indestructible armor, her manicured fingers digging into the heavy cardstock. She did not even bother to open them to verify the contents. She was so blinded by her own greed that the mere physical possession of the documents was enough to satisfy her massive ego. She handed them off to her corporate lawyer, who tucked them securely into his dark leather briefcase with a crisp, finalizing snap of the brass locks. Jamal stepped forward, practically vibrating with pent-up arrogance. He leaned against the edge of Isaiah's polished mahogany desk, crossing his arms over his chest and surveying the room as if he already owned it. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car, paid for by the generous salary Isaiah had insisted on giving him for a phantom consulting role. Jamal had never worked a single day in the logistics field. His entire professional career consisted of bouncing between failed tech startups and vague entrepreneurial ventures, all of them quietly funded by Vivian's endless checkbook to save him from public embarrassment. "Did you really think a firm serving the Department of Defense was going to be run by a woman who does not even have a degree?" Jamal sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with blatant disdain. "Let us be real for a second, Jada. Isaiah put you on the letterhead to play house. He felt sorry for you. You were a cute, uneducated receptionist he rescued from a dead-end life, and he gave you a vanity title to boost your self-esteem. But the adults are talking now." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting his vicious words hang in the stagnant air of the executive suite. The sheer audacity of his narrative was breathtaking. While Jamal was busy failing out of a prestigious business program and racking up reckless credit card debt, I was navigating federal compliance audits and negotiating complex supply chain logistics with four-star generals. I had built the infrastructure of Vanguard Logistics from the ground up, sacrificing my sleep, my sanity, and my youth to turn Isaiah's raw vision into a highly profitable reality. But in their eyes, I was nothing more than a gold digger who had stumbled into a boardroom by sheer accident. "Mom holds the majority voting rights from his seed capital." Jamal continued, pushing off the desk and taking a step closer to me. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "We are restructuring the board effective immediately. You are officially locked out of the accounts, the vendor portals, and this building." As Jamal laid out their fabricated legal reality, the final pieces of their meticulously crafted puzzle slammed into place inside my mind. The timeline of their betrayal was staggering in its absolute cruelty. 5 days ago, Isaiah had collapsed in our kitchen from a massive cardiac event. For 3 agonizing days, he lay in the intensive care unit, hooked up to a ventilator, while a team of specialists desperately tried to save his life. I had not slept a single hour. I had not eaten. I had sat in a plastic hospital chair, holding his cold hand, listening to the rhythmic, terrifying beep of the heart monitor, and begging the universe for a miracle. While I was suffocating under the weight of an impending tragedy, Vivian and Jamal were holding emergency meetings with their corporate lawyer. While I was speaking with surgeons and signing medical consent forms, Chloe was figuring out how to bypass the security cameras in the executive suite to raid my husband's private safe. They had not shed a single genuine tear for Isaiah because they were too busy salivating over his financial empire. They had plotted a hostile corporate takeover over the warmth of his deathbed. I looked at Vivian, who was watching me with a cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "You planned this while he was dying," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Your son was taking his final breaths, and you were drafting a corporate coup." Vivian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She lifted her chin, her face hardening into a mask of righteous indignation. "I was securing my family's legacy," Vivian shot back, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jamal. "Isaiah was a brilliant man, but he was blinded by his affection for you. He was reckless to put so much power into the hands of someone with your background. I loaned him the initial $50,000 to secure his first warehouse lease. That seed capital makes me the foundational investor. Vanguard Logistics belongs to the bloodline Jada, not to a temporary wife." The corporate lawyer cleared his throat, stepping smoothly into the conversation to lend a veneer of legal legitimacy to their blatant theft. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking at me with the practiced, emotionless gaze of a man who specialized in crushing people for a living. Mrs. Wilson, the lawyer, stated, his tone flat and clinical. "My clients have taken physical possession of the primary operating agreements and the master commercial leases. As per the restructuring drafted last night, your access badges and corporate credentials have been deactivated by the IT department. We are prepared to offer you a nominal severance package of $50,000 to walk away quietly and relinquish any contested claims to the company." $50,000. The exact amount of Vivian's initial loan from a decade ago. It was not just a buyout. It was a deliberate, calculated insult meant to strip me of my dignity. Vanguard Logistics generated tens of millions in annual revenue, and they were offering me a severance package that barely covered a mid-size sedan. "If you refuse to sign the severance agreement today," the lawyer continued smoothly, completely ignoring my silence, "my clients are prepared to freeze all of your personal bank accounts tied to the business payroll. You will be locked in aggressive litigation for a decade, and frankly, you simply do not have the capital to fight us. It would be in your best financial interest to take the money and leave the premises immediately." I looked around the room, fully realizing how meticulously they had cornered me in my own office. Chloe stood guarding the door, a smug smile plastered across her face, clearly thrilled to be part of the winning team. Jamal was practically glowing with unearned victory. Vivian was staring at me like an insect she had finally managed to trap under a glass. They had stripped my safe, hijacked my company, and surrounded me with a hostile firing squad. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They believed that because I did not possess a fancy degree from an Ivy League university, I was incapable of understanding corporate structure. They thought the blue manila folders they had stolen from the wall safe were the literal keys to the kingdom. I let the heavy, oppressive silence stretch, allowing their unearned arrogance to swell to its absolute breaking point. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give them the hysterical, defeated reaction they were so desperately craving. I stood my ground, staring directly into Vivian's cold eyes, knowing something she did not. The silver pen, resting on the polished mahogany desk, seemed to mock me under the bright fluorescent lights of the executive suite. It was a heavy, expensive instrument placed there with the singular purpose of signing away my life, my dignity, and the empire I had built with my bare hands. I stared at it, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became a tangible, suffocating weight. I could hear the shallow, rapid breathing of the people surrounding me. They were hungry for this. They were desperate for my surrender. Vivian stood with her shoulders squared, her chin tilted up in a posture of absolute imperial dominance. She held the stack of blue manila folders, the stolen master operating agreements clutched tightly against her chest as if they were a shield. Beside her, Jamal shifted his weight from foot to foot, a predatory smirk plastered across his face. He was already imagining his new title, his new office, and the endless stream of corporate funds he planned to funnel into his vanity projects. By the door, Chloe was practically vibrating with nervous excitement, her eyes darting between my face and the severance contract. She had played her part perfectly, delivering the documents to Vivian, and now she was waiting for her reward. The corporate lawyer let out a short, impatient sigh. He tapped his manicured index finger against the corner of the $50,000 severance agreement. "Time is of the essence," Mrs. Wilson, the lawyer, stated, his voice a flat, clinical drone designed to strip away any remaining emotion. "My clients have a very busy schedule today, including an emergency board meeting to formally transition the executive power structure. We need your signature on the bottom line. It is the smartest financial decision you can make at this juncture. Fighting this will only drain what little resources you have left." I looked at the lawyer, taking in his tailored suit and his cold, dead eyes. Then I looked at Vivian. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed that because I did not come from money, because I did not possess an Ivy League degree, I was simply a naive, uneducated girl who could be bullied into submission. She thought the $50,000 was a gracious parting gift for a stray dog she was kicking out into the street. They did not understand that their desperate need for my signature was the ultimate proof of their weakness. If Vivian truly held the ironclad legal power she claimed to possess, she would not be offering me a single dime. She would have simply thrown me out. The severance agreement was a legal band-aid, a desperate attempt to plug a massive hole in their corporate takeover strategy. They needed me to voluntarily relinquish my rights because deep down, their lawyers knew that Isaiah's seed capital did not automatically grant them control over the intellectual property I had personally developed. But I was not going to give them a legal lesson. I was going to give them a nightmare. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the posture of a broken, defeated woman. I let out a long, shaky breath, casting my eyes downward, as if the fight had completely drained out of me. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my voice faint and submissive. Chloe let out a sharp, audible gasp of delight. Jamal chuckled a low, ugly sound of victory. Vivian smiled, her eyes gleaming with a toxic mixture of satisfaction and profound contempt. "Smart girl," Vivian sneered, stepping closer to the desk. "Sign it, Jada. Take the money and go quietly. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I reached out slowly, my hand trembling just enough to sell the performance. I wrapped my fingers around the heavy silver barrel of the pen. I pulled the $50,000 severance agreement closer to me, smoothing the crisp white paper with my left hand. I leaned over the mahogany desk, positioning myself perfectly. Right next to the legal document, sitting perilously close to the edge of the desk, was the extra-large, venti-sized cup of coffee Chloe had brought into the office earlier. Steam was still rising from the small opening in the plastic lid. It was scalding hot, freshly brewed, and completely full. I hovered the silver pen over the signature line. Vivian leaned in, her eyes locked onto the tip of the pen, holding her breath, in anticipation of the final stroke that would erase me from her family forever. I did not sign my name. Instead, I shifted my weight sharply to the right and drove my elbow backward with brutal, calculated force. My arm slammed directly into the side of the massive coffee cup. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The plastic lid popped off instantly, flying through the air as a violent tidal wave of dark, boiling liquid erupted across the desk. The scalding coffee hit the stack of original operating agreements Vivian had foolishly set down near the severance package. The thick blue manila folders absorbed the dark liquid, instantly warping and curling under the intense heat. The coffee flooded across the mahogany surface, drowning the $50,000 contract, bleeding the fresh black ink into a muddy, illegible swamp of ruined paper. The dark liquid did not stop at the edge of the desk. A steaming waterfall cascaded over the side, splashing directly onto the corporate lawyer's expensive leather shoes and the cuffs of his tailored trousers. Absolute chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. The lawyer yelped in pain, jumping backward and violently shaking his leg as the hot coffee soaked through his socks. Jamal froze in pure, unadulterated shock, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the destruction of their master plan. Vivian shrieked. It was a shrill, guttural sound of absolute panic. She lunged forward, completely abandoning her regal composure, and slammed her bare hands into the boiling puddle of coffee. She clawed frantically at the ruined operating agreements, desperately trying to salvage the dissolving paper. Dark brown stains coated her hands and splashed onto her expensive charcoal blazer. The documents tore apart in her fingers, the ink running in long, muddy streaks across the desk. I took a precise step backward, ensuring my heels remained completely clear of the expanding mess. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, watching the most arrogant woman I had ever known scrabble like a rat over a pile of wet garbage. "Oops," I said. My voice rang out through the executive suite, clear, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. Vivian's head snapped up. Her hands were dripping with coffee and ink. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. Her chest heaved, but she was so consumed by shock and fury that she could not even form a single coherent word. "Guess you will have to print new ones," I added casually. I opened my hand and dropped the heavy silver pen. It fell through the air and landed directly in the center of the muddy puddle, sinking into the ruined, soaking remains of their ridiculous severance agreement with a satisfying final splat. "See you in court, Vivian." I turned my back on all of them. I did not rush. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite with perfect measured steps, my posture radiating absolute authority. Behind me, the room descended into frantic shouting. Jamal was yelling for paper towels, the lawyer was cursing loudly about his ruined suit, and Vivian was screaming my name in a tone of pure venomous hatred. The sound of their panic was music to my ears. The elevator doors opened at the end of the hall. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the chaos of the executive suite shrink as the metal doors slid shut. They thought I was acting out of hysterical desperation. They thought destroying a few pieces of paper was the final pathetic tantrum of a defeated widow. They had absolutely no idea that I had not just destroyed their contracts. I had just fired the opening shot of a war they had already lost. 3 days passed in absolute suffocating silence. Vivian did not call. Jamal did not text. Chloe did not attempt any more of her pathetic fake sympathy ambushes. They were regrouping, licking their wounds from the coffee incident, and calling in their most expensive favors. I used those 72 hours to sit down with my own legal counsel, Tasha. Tasha was a force of nature, a brilliant razor-sharp attorney who specialized in corporate litigation and asset protection. I laid every single card on the table for her. I showed her the master commercial leases, the software patents, and the holding company structures I had secured. Tasha had smiled a slow, dangerous smile, packed her heavy leather briefcase, and told me to buy a new suit for the official will reading. The offices of Sterling Hayes and Carmichael sat on the 42nd floor of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. The environment was aggressively sterile, designed to intimidate the moment you stepped off the elevator. The floors were polished white marble, the walls were frosted glass, and the air conditioning was cranked down to a temperature that felt like a meat locker. It was a space built for wealthy people to quietly destroy each other without leaving blood on the carpet. Tasha and I sat on one side of a massive cold mahogany conference table. Tasha had her files neatly organized, her hands folded calmly in her lap, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable readiness. She was prepared for a standard asset split dispute. We fully expected Vivian to challenge the valuation of Vanguard Logistics or demand an exorbitant payout for her initial seed capital. We were ready to shut down every single financial demand with surgical precision. The heavy glass door to the conference room swung open, and the temperature in the room somehow dropped another 10 degrees. Vivian led the charge, flanked by a small army. She was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. her chin tilted up in a posture of unquestionable dominance. Jamal swaggered in right behind her wearing a designer suit that looked entirely too tight across his shoulders, sporting a smug, self-satisfied grin. Chloe trailed behind them, her face fixed in a neutral, practiced mask, though her eyes darted nervously toward me before quickly looking away. Bringing up the rear were Vivian's high-priced legal team. There were three of them led by a silver-haired shark named Vance. He had the kind of polished, arrogant demeanor that only came from decades of billing clients $1,000 an hour to ruin people's lives. They took their seats across the mahogany table, forming a literal wall of hostility. The physical divide in the room was palpable. It was me and Tasha against an empire of entitlement. Vivian did not say a word to me. She did not offer a greeting, a nod, or even a basic acknowledgement of my humanity. She simply sat back in her plush leather chair, crossed her legs, and stared at me with eyes full of venomous triumph. She looked exactly like a woman who knew she was holding the winning lottery ticket. Tasha leaned forward, her voice cutting through the heavy silence with crisp authority. "Gentlemen, Vivian." Tasha began, her tone perfectly even. "We are here for the formal reading and execution of Isaiah Wilson's last will and testament, properly notarized and filed 2 years ago. As you are aware, my client, Jada Wilson, is named as the primary beneficiary and sole executor of the estate. We are prepared to discuss the distribution of personal assets and address any immediate concerns regarding the operational continuity of Vanguard Logistics." Vance, Vivian's lead attorney, let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. He did not open a single folder. He did not look at Tasha's meticulously prepared documents. Instead, he folded his hands on top of the bare mahogany table and offered a tight, condescending smile. "That will not be necessary," Counselor Vance stated, his voice smooth and dripping with mock sympathy. "The document you are referring to from 2 years ago is unfortunately no longer the controlling instrument of Mr. Wilson's estate." Tasha did not flinch. Her expression remained completely stony. "Excuse me," Tasha replied, her voice dropping an octave. "We have the certified documents directly from the county clerk. There is no other registered will on file." Vance exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Vivian. Vivian's smile widened, revealing her perfectly white teeth. She looked like a predator watching its prey step willingly into a snare. "You are correct that there is no other document on file with the county," Vance said, reaching slowly into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "However, the law provides for extenuating circumstances, particularly when a testator wishes to make final urgent amendments regarding his legacy." My heart slammed against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I watched in total silence as Vance pulled his hand out of his jacket. He was holding a slightly crumpled, unsealed white envelope. He placed it deliberately in the exact center of the mahogany table, keeping his manicured fingers resting lightly on top of the paper. The sound of the paper brushing against the wood seemed to echo off the frosted glass walls. Tasha narrowed her eyes, her posture instantly shifting from procedural readiness to aggressive defense. "What exactly is that, Vance?" Tasha demanded. "We are not playing parlor games today. Produce the legal standing for this meeting or we are leaving." "This," Vance announced, sliding the unsealed envelope a few inches toward our side of the table, "is a holographic codicil. A handwritten, legally binding amendment to Isaiah Wilson's will. It was discovered by his mother, Vivian, just yesterday, tucked inside a private journal at his childhood home." Jamal let out a sharp, arrogant laugh, leaning back and crossing his arms behind his head. "Looks like my brother finally came to his senses before he passed," Jamal sneered. I stared at the unsealed envelope, my blood running completely cold. A handwritten amendment, discovered by Vivian. The absolute audacity of their scheme was breathtaking. They had realized that the stolen corporate documents covered in coffee were essentially useless without my signature, so they had pivoted to a completely different, far more sinister strategy. They were not just trying to bully me out of the company anymore. They were actively attempting to rewrite my husband's final wishes through outright undeniable fraud. Vivian leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, her eyes locking onto mine with ruthless intensity. She did not look like a grieving mother. She looked like an executioner. Isaiah wanted his legacy protected. Jada, Vivian said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. He wanted his life's work to remain with his true family. He realized right at the very end that you were never truly equipped to carry his name. You should have taken the $50,000 when you had the chance, because now you are walking away with absolutely nothing. Vance's manicured fingers gripped the edge of the unsealed white envelope. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the climate control system working to keep the temperature perfectly frigid. With agonizing slowness, he extracted a single sheet of heavy ivory paper. I recognized the watermark instantly. It was Isaiah's personal stationery, the expensive custom-pressed stock he kept exclusively in his home office for handwritten correspondence. Vance smoothed the paper onto the cold mahogany table. This codicil was executed by Isaiah Wilson exactly 3 days prior to his unfortunate medical emergency. Vance stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. In this document, Mr. Wilson explicitly revokes the previous distribution of his primary assets. He transfers his entire 80% stake in Vanguard Logistics directly to his mother, Vivian Wilson. Furthermore, the deed to the Beacon Hill residence is also transferred to her immediate possession. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Let me see that document, Vance. You know as well as I do that a holographic will require specific legal thresholds to supersede a notarized estate plan in this jurisdiction." Vance slid a high-quality photocopy across the table, keeping his hand firmly planted on the original ivory sheet. The stated reasoning for this abrupt change is also clearly outlined in his own handwriting. Vance continued, a cruel smile playing on his thin lips. Mr. Wilson notes severe concerns regarding Jada's financial instability and her complete lack of executive experience. He explicitly states he wanted his legacy protected from mismanagement. Tasha grabbed the photocopy before it even stopped sliding. I leaned over her shoulder, my eyes scanning the blue ink. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Tasha immediately started shaking her head, her mind already building an impenetrable defense. "This is absurd," Tasha said, her voice sharp and ringing with absolute authority. "We will challenge this instantly. I am looking at coercion, diminished capacity, and potentially outright fraud." Isaiah Wilson built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire with his wife. He would not dismantle it on a single sheet of stationery without consulting his general counsel. But I was not listening to Tasha. I was staring at the bottom of the page. The signature was not a forgery. It was a perfect, unhesitating match. The sharp angle of the I, the sweeping, distinct loop of the W. It was undeniably Isaiah's handwriting. For a terrifying second, the room tilted. Had my husband secretly doubted me? Had he truly believed I was financially unstable? Had the man I loved and built a life with actually planned to strip me of everything we had built together? Then clarity pierced through the confusion like a bolt of lightning. I remembered exactly what had happened 3 days before his heart attack. Vivian had shown up at our house in absolute hysterics. She had barricaded herself in Isaiah's home office, weeping uncontrollably about Jamal. Jamal had borrowed heavily from some very dangerous, unregulated private lenders to fund another failed software startup. The lenders were threatening extreme violence. Vivian needed proof of massive collateral to restructure the debt and save her golden child from being completely ruined. Isaiah, ever the fiercely protective son, had drafted a temporary pledge of assets to act as a financial shield for his mother. He signed it specifically to protect her and Jamal from their own reckless stupidity. He had told me later that night it was just a shell document, a meaningless piece of paper meant to hold off the creditors until he could legally untangle Jamal's massive financial mess. Vivian had taken my husband's act of desperate love and weaponized it to destroy me. I looked up from the photocopy. Vivian was watching me, her eyes gleaming with toxic satisfaction. She knew that I knew. She knew the exact context of the signature, and she simply did not care. She had the piece of paper, and in this sterile room, that piece of paper was ultimate power. Chloe leaned forward, unable to contain her petty excitement. We are going to redecorate the house. Jada, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It needs a little class. All those cheap modern art pieces you bought are going straight into the dumpster. You have until Friday to pack your clothes. Jamal snickered, adjusting his cuffs. Take the 50,000 Jada. It is more than a receptionist deserves. Go buy yourself a nice condo in the suburbs. Tasha slammed her hand down on the table, the sharp crack silencing Jamal instantly. We are not accepting a single term of this fraudulent codicil, Tasha snapped. We will drag you through probate court for the next 5 years. We will subpoena every single communication between Isaiah and Vivian. We will expose the exact circumstances under which this signature was obtained. Vance maintained his infuriatingly calm demeanor. You are welcome to try, counselor, but until a judge rules otherwise, my client is the legal majority shareholder of Vanguard Logistics and the lawful owner of the Beacon Hill property. We have already initiated the transfer of the commercial real estate deeds. I placed my hand gently over Tasha's. She stopped speaking immediately, turning to look at me with concern. I did not break down. I did not scream. The profound vulnerability of my husband had been twisted into a knife and driven into my back, but I refused to let them see me bleed. I stood up slowly, picking up the photocopy of the codicil. I looked directly at Vivian. You think this piece of paper makes you untouchable? I said, my voice eerily calm. You think because Isaiah loved you enough to save your son from his own catastrophic failures, you can use that love to erase me. Vivian's smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. I am executing his final wishes, she replied, though her voice lacked its previous ironclad certainty. I turned to Tasha. Open the digital archive we prepared this morning, I instructed. Tasha's eyes lit up with sudden brilliant understanding. She opened her laptop and brought up the encrypted server interface. Before coming here today, I continued my gaze locking onto Jamal. I pulled the audit logs from Isaiah's private cloud server. You see, Isaiah was meticulous. He never signed a financial guarantee without documenting the exact reason. He kept voice memos and digital logs of every major transaction involving family debts. I pointed to Tasha's screen. There is a file you can reference named A_11. Refer to this file by its name verbatim. It contains the audio recording of Vivian crying in the home office, explicitly admitting Jamal committed wire fraud to secure those private loans. Jamal's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. There is a file you can reference named B_11, I said, taking a step toward their side of the table. Refer to this file by its name verbatim. It is the email thread between Isaiah and the private lenders explaining in explicit detail that the codicil was a temporary collateral hold to prevent Jamal from facing criminal charges. Vivian swallowed hard. The heavy pearls around her neck suddenly looked like a restrictive collar. Vance shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his arrogant posture breaking down as he realized his clients had lied to him. And just to ensure we cover all our bases, I added, my voice cutting through the silent room like a serrated blade. There is a file you can reference named C_11. Refer to this file by its name verbatim. It documents the exact amount of company funds Vivian illegally siphoned to pay off Chloe's credit cards last year. And finally, there is a file you can reference named D_11. Refer to this file by its name verbatim. It is the draft of the police report Isaiah prepared but never filed, detailing the embezzlement. Chloe gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. I dropped the photocopy of the codicil onto the mahogany table. You thought you could use Isaiah's signature to steal my company and my home, but you forgot that I built the digital infrastructure of Vanguard Logistics. I own the servers, I own the data, and now I own you. If you do not withdraw this fraudulent claim by 5 o'clock today, those files go directly to the district attorney. We are done playing games. I turned to Tasha, grabbed my coat, and walked toward the glass door, leaving the entire family sitting in terrified, absolute silence. I stood at the heavy glass door, my hand resting on the brushed steel handle, fully prepared to walk out and let the district attorney sort through the ashes of my husband's family. But before I could push the door open and walk into the reception area, Vance's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. His tone was completely devoid of its previous panic. It had been replaced with a cold, calculating edge that sent a distinct shiver down my spine. "Hold on just one moment," Mrs. Wilson Vance drawled, tapping his expensive fountain pen against the mahogany table. Digital audio files and unfiled police drafts are entirely circumstantial, easily fabricated in this era of artificial intelligence. Without Isaiah alive to authenticate those server logs under oath, establishing a chain of custody for electronic evidence will be a procedural nightmare. You take those files to the district attorney, and I guarantee my firm will tie them up in evidentiary motions and admissibility hearings until the end of the decade. We will bury you in paperwork before a single investigator even opens an audio file. Tasha grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight and urgent. She pulled me back toward the conference table, her face having lost its triumphant glow. It was replaced by the grim, pragmatic mask of a defense attorney calculating the reality of a losing battle. Tasha was brilliant, but she was also a realist. She knew when a bluff had been called. She pulled me into my chair and leaned in close, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper that only I could hear beneath the hum of the air conditioning. Jada listened to me very carefully. Tasha whispered, her eyes dark with concern. "He is absolutely right. If we contest this holographic codicil and bring the digital files into a massive probate fight, Vanguard Logistics goes into immediate receivership. The court will freeze every single corporate asset, every bank account, every vendor contract, and every payroll line will be locked down until the litigation is fully resolved. And worse, because you are challenging a document with a verified, authentic signature from your husband, the burden of proof falls entirely on our shoulders." I stared at the high-quality photocopy of the codicil resting on the table. Isaiah's signature mocked me. The sharp angle of the I and the sweeping loop of the W were undeniably real. He had signed that paper to protect Vivian from Jamal's violent creditors. He had signed it as a temporary shield, never imagining his own mother would use it to steal his legacy from his wife. "It will take years," Tasha continued, her whisper urgent and pleading. "It will cost millions of dollars in legal fees just to reach the discovery phase. We will have to hire forensic accountants, handwriting experts, and digital security specialists. Because your personal finances are heavily tied to the business accounts, Vivian's team will file injunctions to freeze your personal assets too. They will bleed your accounts completely dry before we even get to a judge. You will be bankrupt within 6 months, Jada. They have the war chest to drag this out. You do not." I looked across the wide expanse of the cold mahogany table. Vivian had recovered her composure completely. The initial terror of my digital threat had evaporated from her face, replaced by a deep, vibrating greed. She sat up perfectly straight, practically buzzing with anticipation as she watched Tasha and me confer in hushed tones. Vivian was waiting for the reality of the situation to crush me. She was waiting for the tears, the desperate pleading, the complete emotional breakdown of the uneducated receptionist she had always believed me to be. She was feeding on my apparent defeat. Next to her, Jamal was grinning again. He leaned over and whispered something crude to Chloe. Chloe let out a sharp hyena-like laugh and picked up her phone. "We are going to redecorate the house, Jada." Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and petty vindictiveness. "It needs a little class. All those cheap modern art pieces you bought are going straight into the dumpster. You have until Friday to pack your clothes and get out of my new guest room." Jamal snickered, adjusting his custom cuffs. "Take the 50,000, Jada. It is more than a fake executive deserves. Go buy yourself a nice little condo in the suburbs and leave the real business to the bloodline." They had the money. They had the time. They had the complete lack of moral boundaries required to drag this out until I had absolutely nothing left. They wanted a war of attrition. They wanted to slowly crush my spirit over the next 5 years, draining my finances and dragging Isaiah's name through the mud in public court records. But as I sat there staring at their smug, entitled faces, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I realized exactly what they were doing, but more importantly, I realized what they did not know. They thought running Vanguard Logistics was just about sitting in a fancy corner office and cashing massive federal checks. They thought owning the Beacon Hill house was just about throwing lavish dinner parties and bragging to their country club friends. They did not understand the crushing weight of the federal compliance audits. They did not know about the looming supply chain crisis I had been secretly managing for the past 3 months. They did not know that the master leases for the commercial warehouses required my personal guarantor signature to remain active, or that the federal defense contracts were entirely contingent on my specific security clearance. Vanguard Logistics, without me at the helm, was not a gold mine. It was a financial sinkhole. And the Beacon Hill house they coveted so deeply was heavily leveraged against a massive balloon payment due in exactly 30 days, a payment only I knew how to restructure. I was not going to give them a war of attrition. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, because they were entirely too stupid to realize they were demanding their own execution. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed the lapels of my coat and sat up perfectly straight. I reached out, placing my fingertips lightly on the edge of the high-quality photocopy of the forged addendum. With a single, smooth, deliberate motion, I slid the document across the polished wood. It came to a stop directly in front of Vance. "I am not fighting it," I declared. The words hung in the sterile, freezing air of the conference room. Tasha gasped. It was a sharp, loud intake of breath that echoed off the frosted glass walls. She grabbed my wrist, her eyes wide with absolute professional horror and genuine shock. "Jada, what are you doing?" she hissed frantically, her composure breaking for the very first time. "We can figure this out. We can find a pro bono firm. We can find a way to litigate this without draining your reserves. You cannot just hand them everything." I ignored her, pulling my wrist gently from her grasp. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Vivian. Vivian did not smile. Instead, a deep, highly suspicious frown creased her forehead. Her eyes darted frantically from the paper to my face, scanning my neutral expression for the trick, the hidden trap, the counterattack she assumed was coming. She had come prepared for a brutal, drawn-out legal slaughter. My sudden, complete capitulation unsettled her far more than my threats ever could. She knew I was a fierce fighter. Handing over an empire without a single drop of blood being spilled defied her entire understanding of who I was. Jamal stopped laughing instantly. His smug grin vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Chloe put her phone face down on the table, her petty comments dying in her throat. Even Vance looked momentarily thrown off balance, his manicured hand hovering uncertainly over the returned document, as if it might suddenly catch fire. "I am not spending the next 5 years of my life chained to this toxic family in a courtroom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, stripping it of any grief or anger. "You want Vanguard Logistics. You want the Beacon Hill house. You want the legacy. You can have all of it. Every single asset, every single contract, and every ounce of the crushing weight that comes with running a federal contracting firm. It is yours." I stood up, grabbing my purse and slinging the heavy leather strap over my shoulder. I looked down at Vance, who was staring at me with a mixture of professional skepticism and utter bewilderment. "Have your associates prepare the final irrevocable transfer documents," I instructed him. My tone mirrored the cold clinical authority he had tried to use on me. "Make sure they are absolutely flawless. I will sign the transfer papers on Friday at the final hearing." I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. I did not wait for Tasha to gather her briefcases. I did not look back at Vivian's paranoid, suspicious glare, or Jamal's confused, heavy silence. I strode down the long, polished marble hallway toward the elevators, my heels clicking a steady, triumphant rhythm against the stone floor. They thought they had just staged the perfect corporate coup. They thought my surrender was a sign of total defeat and financial terror. They had absolutely no idea that by taking Vanguard Logistics and the Beacon Hill house, they had just willingly swallowed a ticking financial time bomb. And on Friday, I was going to gladly hand them the detonator. I didn't even make it to the ground floor lobby of the skyscraper before my phone began vibrating with a relentless stream of automated security alerts. Vivian and Jamal were wasting absolutely no time asserting their newly acquired dominance. By the time I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, I had received 16 separate notifications from the Vanguard Logistics Information Technology Department. My administrative access to the master servers was being systematically and ruthlessly revoked. I stood on the crowded sidewalk watching the little red warning icons multiply across my screen. They were locking me out of the encrypted company email network, severing my connection to the real-time financial dashboards, and disabling my biometric keycard access to the downtown headquarters. A normal person would have panicked watching their life's work be digitally erased in real time. I simply smiled, pocketing my phone. They were rushing with blind arrogance to seize control of the steering wheel, completely failing to realize that the brakes had already been cut. Every single access credential they revoked was one less piece of legal liability, tying me to the impending catastrophic default. Let them have the master servers. Let them lock me out of the accounting software. They were going to need absolute control when the federal auditors came knocking regarding the supply chain irregularities I had been holding at bay. I drove straight back to the Beacon Hill property to gather my personal essentials before Friday's final probate hearing. I expected a hostile reception, but I profoundly underestimated their sheer aggressive entitlement. The moment I pulled onto the cobblestone street, I saw a massive luxury moving truck parked illegally across our front lawn, its heavy tires completely crushing the blue hydrangeas Isaiah and I had painstakingly planted. The heavy oak front door of my home was propped wide open. I walked into the grand foyer and immediately tripped over a towering stack of high-end designer luggage. Chloe's shrill, commanding voice echoed down the spiral staircase from the master bedroom. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet, and found her standing in the center of the room, flanked by two burly movers. She was holding a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags, aggressively ripping my tailored business suits and expensive silk blouses off their velvet hangers and stuffing them into the cheap plastic. Vivian stood casually by the bay window, a crystal glass of my expensive vintage wine in her hand, directing the movers to dismantle the custom mahogany bed frame Isaiah and I had commissioned. "You are early," Jada Vivian remarked, taking a leisurely sip of the dark red wine. She did not even bother to turn around and look at me. "We assumed you would be busy crying to your useless attorney or begging the bank for a personal loan. Grab a bag and help Chloe. We have custom Italian furniture arriving from Milan on Wednesday morning, and your cheap department store rags are taking up valuable closet space." Chloe smirked, tossing a half-filled trash bag directly at my feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, spilling a few of my favorite cashmere sweaters onto the polished hardwood floor. "Do not worry," Chloe chimed in, her eyes gleaming with toxic, unadulterated delight. "I made sure to leave your sensible flat work shoes. You are going to need them when you start taking the bus to your new interviews for receptionist jobs." I looked at the trash bag, then up at the two women who were actively violating the sacred sanctuary I had shared with my late husband. Every natural instinct screamed at me to fight back, to physically throw them out of my house, to unleash the devastating digital evidence I still held securely on my encrypted drives. But my strategy required absolute, unwavering discipline. They needed to believe they had completely broken my spirit. I silently bent down, picked up the garbage bag of my clothes, and carried it out to my car without saying a single word. I spent the next 2 hours making silent, methodical trips back and forth, packing only my personal identification documents, my jewelry, and the clothing I could easily fit into the trunk of my sedan. I left the expensive modern artwork on the walls. I left the high-end electronics and the luxury furniture. I left them the intoxicating illusion of absolute unchallenged victory. The ultimate test of my emotional discipline came 2 days later at our Sunday church service. Isaiah and I had attended First Fellowship for years. It was a central pillar of the local community, a place where prominent business leaders and faith intertwined. I arrived early, taking a seat near the back of the sanctuary, hoping for a brief moment of quiet reflection before the service began. That fragile hope shattered the moment the heavy wooden sanctuary doors swung open. Vivian led her family down the center aisle like a conquering monarch returning from a glorious war. She was draped in a brand new, aggressively flashy designer outfit, but it was her jewelry that caught my eye. She was dripping in diamonds that I immediately recognized. They were the custom teardrop earrings Isaiah had purchased for our 5th wedding anniversary, the very ones I had left secured in the master bedroom safe. Jamal strutted beside her in a bespoke tailored suit that cost more than most people's vehicles, while Chloe paraded a limited edition highly recognizable handbag like a hunting trophy. They did not quietly take their seats in their usual pew. Vivian stopped directly in the front of the church, intercepting Pastor Williams. She ensured she was positioned exactly where the maximum number of early congregants could hear her every word. "Pastor Williams." Vivian announced, her voice pitched loud and clear enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows. "We have so much to be thankful for today. The Lord has truly delivered our family from darkness and deception. We have officially secured Isaiah's estate and retaken control of his company." The pastor smiled politely, though his eyes darted nervously over the congregation, briefly landing on me sitting in the back. "That is wonderful news, Vivian. We have been praying continually for your family's peace and healing during this difficult transition." "It is much more than peace," Vivian continued, her voice growing intentionally louder, sharper, making absolutely certain every syllable carried to the back pews. "It is a rescue mission. We finally saved my son's legacy from that leech. You would not believe the catastrophic state of the company pastor. She was draining it completely dry, trying to steal every single asset my boy built from the ground up. But God revealed the truth. We found Isaiah's true final wishes, and we finally cut that manipulative gold digger out of our lives for good." A heavy, suffocating silence immediately fell over the entire congregation. Heads turned slowly. Whispers erupted among the pews like dry leaves catching fire in the wind. I felt the collective burning gaze of 200 people lock onto me. I saw genuine pity in the eyes of some older members and harsh, unforgiving judgment in the eyes of others who eagerly consumed Vivian's venomous theatrical narrative. Chloe leaned against the polished wooden pew, her voice easily carrying over the rising whispers. "She is practically homeless now. It is a tragedy, really, but that is exactly what happens when you try to play out of your league and steal from a real family." I sat perfectly still in the hard wooden pew, staring straight ahead. The humiliation was intense, a burning physical sensation that tightened my chest and made my hands shake slightly in my lap. They were systematically stripping away my dignity in front of the community I loved, aggressively rewriting the history of my loving marriage into a cheap, sordid tale of greed and manipulation. I forced myself to absorb every single whispered insult, every pitying glance, every ounce of their very public scorn. I let them paint me as the defeated, greedy, incompetent villain. I swallowed the bitter humiliation whole, intentionally letting it fuel the fire of my resolve. They wanted a spectacle of my defeat, so I gave them my total silence. Let them revel in their stolen jewels and their counterfeit victory. Friday was only 5 days away, and the trap was perfectly set. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill that perfectly matched my mood. The intense public humiliation from Sunday's service was already yesterday's news, fading into the background noise of my mind. My phone had been blowing up for 24 hours, with fake sympathy texts from church members and gloating social media updates from Chloe, who was busy posting pictures of my custom kitchen counters. I ignored every single one of them. While Vivian and her parasitic offspring were busy measuring drapes and celebrating their perceived dominance, I was sitting across from Tasha in her downtown corner office, drinking black coffee and preparing to execute a financial massacre. Tasha's office was the absolute antithesis of Vivian's flashy, loud aesthetic. It was a fortress of polished concrete, dark leather, and soundproof glass. Tasha sat behind her massive desk, a mountain of legal files stacked neatly to her left. She still looked slightly pale, clearly recovering from the shock of my total capitulation in Vance's conference room. She was a fighter by nature, and watching a client willingly lay down her sword went against every instinct she possessed. She slid the final transfer agreements across the desk toward me. Her manicured finger tapped the thick stack of paper. "Here it is." Jada, Tasha said, her voice laced with heavy reluctance. The complete surrender of Vanguard Logistics and the Beacon Hill estate. Vance fast-tracked the paperwork just like you asked. Vivian is already listed as the primary shareholder on the corporate registry pending your signature on Friday. I have to ask you one last time before we finalize this suicide mission. Are you absolutely certain you want to sign everything over to that monster? I did not even look at the transfer papers. Instead, I reached down into my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, unmarked black binder. I placed it squarely on top of the Vanguard Logistics transfer documents, effectively burying Vivian's ultimate prize under a mountain of my own carefully curated paperwork. I am not signing away an empire, Tasha, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. I am handing Vivian a sinking ship. I need you to stop looking at Vanguard Logistics. That company is nothing but a decorative shell. Open the black binder. We need to review the quarterly filings for Vanguard Holdings LLC. Tasha frowned, thoroughly confused. She pulled the black binder toward her and flipped it open. Vanguard Holdings. She repeated, her brow furrowing as she scanned the first page of the corporate charter. I have never seen these operating agreements in any of the primary estate files. Vance never mentioned this entity. Vivian never demanded it. That is because Vivian has absolutely no idea it exists, I replied, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. And Vance is too lazy to look past the primary corporate registration. They all think Isaiah was the sole genius behind our success because of his military rank and his commanding public presence. They assumed the handsome, decorated officer built the machine, and the quiet wife just handled the interior decorating and the petty cash. They never bothered to actually read the foundational corporate structure. Tasha began flipping through the pages, her eyes darting rapidly across the dense legal text, the patent registration numbers, and the master commercial lease agreements. The silence in the office was profound, broken only by the sharp rustle of heavy paper as she turned page after page. Isaiah was a brilliant logistician, I explained, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. He knew how to move freight, how to manage personnel, and how to win federal transportation contracts. But Isaiah was also a high-ranking military officer with top-secret security clearance. Federal regulations regarding massive commercial debt and personal financial liability are incredibly strict for someone holding that level of clearance. If he had personally taken on the multi-million-dollar loans required to secure our commercial warehouses, or if he had personally held the patents for the proprietary dispatch software we developed, it would have triggered endless agonizing reviews from the Department of Defense. It would have jeopardized his entire military career. Tasha stopped turning the pages. Her hands hovered over a massive 50-page commercial real estate lease. She looked up at me, the confusion in her eyes slowly giving way to a brilliant, terrifying spark of realization. So you took the debt, Tasha whispered, the pieces finally snapping together in her razor-sharp mind. I took all the debt, I confirmed, leaning forward and resting my elbows on her desk. I took the risk. I am the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of Vanguard Holdings LLC. Vanguard Holdings owns the master leases on every single commercial warehouse that Vanguard Logistics operates out of. Vanguard Holdings owns the exclusive intellectual property rights and patents to the routing software that dispatches every single truck in their fleet. Vanguard Holdings owns the physical servers they just locked me out of. Tasha let out a sudden sharp bark of laughter. It was a loud, unfiltered sound of pure, unadulterated shock and delight. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking as she stared at the documents. She read the next page, then the next, her laughter growing steadily louder. Jada. Tasha gasped, slamming her hand down on the desk in excitement. You are the landlord. I am the landlord. I agreed, my smile widening into a predatory grin. I am the landlord, I am the patent holder, and I am the software licensor. Vanguard Logistics does not own its warehouses. It rents them from me. Vanguard Logistics does not own its routing system. It licenses it from me. For the past 5 years, Isaiah and I kept the structure entirely separate to protect his clearance. Vanguard Logistics pays a massive monthly premium to Vanguard Holdings just to keep the lights on and the trucks moving. Tasha practically vibrated with aggressive, joyful energy. She tapped a specific clause in the master software licensing agreement. And according to this specific provision right here, if the executive leadership of Vanguard Logistics changes hands without the explicit written approval of Vanguard Holdings LLC, all software licenses are immediately revoked. All commercial leases are subject to immediate non-negotiable termination. Exactly, I said softly. They think they stole an empire, Tasha said, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. They think you are just some gold digger who got lucky. They have no idea they just inherited a massive liability machine that owes its entire operational existence to you. When Vivian signs that document on Friday, assuming she is the queen of the castle, she is legally absorbing all the operational liabilities, the payroll obligations, and the federal contract requirements, while simultaneously defaulting on every single lease and software license required to fulfill those contracts. She will be personally liable for the breach of federal logistics contracts. The second those servers go dark, I added, feeling a profound, icy satisfaction settle deep in my chest. They locked me out of the logistics servers yesterday. They thought it was a power move. What they actually did was violate the terms of service with the Department of Defense. By Friday, Vanguard Logistics will be facing federal breach of contract fines that will completely bankrupt Vivian and Jamal. Tasha leaned back in her chair, her eyes shining with absolute reverence. She looked at me not as a grieving widow, but as a tactical genius who had just engineered the most flawless corporate execution she had ever witnessed. They paraded around that church on Sunday, I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. They humiliated me in front of my entire community. They bragged about rescuing Isaiah's legacy from a leech. They called me a gold digger. But I am not a gold digger. I am the bank. I own the dirt their warehouses sit on. I own the code that runs their trucks. I own the debt that is about to crush them into absolute dust. Tasha closed the black binder with a loud, definitive thud. Her smile was predatory and razor-sharp. So we let them sign the transfer papers on Friday. We let them sign everything I confirmed, standing up and smoothing my coat. We let Vivian put her signature on every single document Vance has prepared. We let her officially, legally claim full ownership of Vanguard Logistics. And the very second the ink dries on that paper, you are going to serve her with a notice of immediate lease termination, a software revocation mandate, and a demand for 30 days past due rent. It will be a bloodbath, Tasha promised, her voice thrumming with anticipation. It will be exactly what they deserve, I replied. I picked up my purse and turned toward the door. Let them celebrate their stolen victory for 4 more days. Let them buy their imported Italian furniture and throw their weight around the office. Because on Friday afternoon, the bill comes due, and I am going to collect every single penny. The crisp Boston air hit my face like a physical wave of liberation as I stepped out of Tasha's high-rise office building. For the first time since Isaiah's sudden passing, my chest did not feel tight. The crushing, suffocating weight of grief and betrayal had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. I hailed a town car and gave the driver the address to the Seaport District. Vivian and Chloe had gleefully assumed that seizing the Beacon Hill house meant I would be sleeping in a cheap motel or begging friends for a couch. They had completely failed to realize that Vanguard Holdings LLC, my actual corporate entity, owned a sprawling top-floor penthouse overlooking the harbor. I had purchased it 2 years ago as a corporate retreat and tax asset. Now it was my command center. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday watching my trap snap shut in glorious high-definition real-time. From the massive monitors in my penthouse office, I had a god's-eye view of the Vanguard Logistics Network. Because Vanguard Holdings owned the proprietary dispatch software, I could see every single operational failure as it happened. By Tuesday afternoon, the first automated alerts began flashing red across my screens. Jamal, in his infinite arrogance, had attempted to bypass the primary security protocols to access the federal payroll accounts. He thought he could just swagger into the finance department and order massive wire transfers to cover his private debts. He did not realize the Department of Defense contracts required a dual authentication biometric key to release those specific funds, a key tied exclusively to my retinas and fingerprints. My phone buzzed constantly with panicked back-channel text messages from loyal managers I had personally trained. They told me Jamal was storming through the warehouse floors, screaming at the dispatchers, completely failing to understand why the trucks were not moving. He was demanding that the IT department override the security protocols. What he did not comprehend was that any unauthorized attempt to override those specific servers triggered an automatic, irrevocable lockdown mandated by federal cybersecurity laws. The system was doing exactly what I had programmed it to do. It was protecting the data from hostile internal actors. By Wednesday morning, the situation had escalated from a localized operational hiccup to a catastrophic company-wide crisis. 3 major shipments of temperature-sensitive medical supplies were stranded at the port. The penalty clauses in our federal contracts dictated a fine of $100,000 for every hour a critical delivery was delayed. I sat back in my leather chair, sipping a rich, dark espresso, and watched the financial penalties rack up into the millions. Vivian was technically the majority shareholder, now pending Friday's signature. Every single dollar of those massive federal fines was about to become her personal legal responsibility. They were bleeding out, and they did not even know they had been cut. Instead of addressing the catastrophic supply chain failure, my former in-laws focused their entire energy on petty domestic cruelty. They were completely blinded by their obsession with the Beacon Hill property. They wanted the status, the prestige, and the physical proof that they had finally conquered me. They spent their days ordering custom European furniture on company credit cards that were about to bounce completely, ignoring the federal auditors who were already beginning to swarm their loading docks. They were throwing their weight around a sinking ship, demanding better cabins while the water poured into the engine room. Thursday evening arrived wrapped in a quiet electric tension. It was the night before the final probate hearing. Tomorrow morning we would all sit before the judge, and I would legally permanently transfer the hollow bankrupt shell of Vanguard Logistics directly into Vivian's greedy hands. Then, Tasha would immediately serve them with the breach of contract notices, the software revocation mandates, and the commercial eviction papers. I poured myself a glass of expensive Cabernet and walked out onto the penthouse balcony. The city lights of Boston reflected beautifully across the dark water of the harbor. The wind whipped my hair around my face, but I felt a profound sense of peace. I had honored Isaiah's true legacy by protecting the actual engine of our success. I had separated the wheat from the chaff, leaving his toxic family holding an empty, collapsing bag. They wanted to erase my contributions and claim the glory for themselves, and I was going to let the brutal reality of federal logistics compliance teach them a lesson they would never forget. My phone buzzed on the glass patio table. I walked over and picked it up. The screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a new text message from Chloe. I swiped open the notification. The message contained a high-resolution photograph. It was a shot of the meticulously manicured front lawn of the Beacon Hill house. Scattered across the pristine green grass were dozens of black industrial trash bags. Some of them were ripped open, exposing the few items of clothing I had deliberately left behind in the guest room closet. A silk scarf I had worn on my honeymoon was trampled into the mud. A pair of running shoes I had bought for a charity marathon were tossed carelessly onto the cobblestone walkway. Beneath the photograph was a text message dripping with venomous, unearned triumph. "We found the rest of your cheap clothes hiding in the guest room," Chloe wrote. "We do not want your trash stinking up our new house. They are out on the lawn where they belong. The garbage collectors come on Monday, but I am sure someone will steal them before then. Make sure you do not show up late to court tomorrow. We want this over with so we can change the locks." I stared at the screen. A year ago, a month ago, or even a week ago, a message like this would have devastated me. It would have sent me into a spiral of tears and desperate anger. I would have felt the burning sting of rejection and the profound violation of my personal space. I would have mourned the loss of the home where I had built a life with the man I loved. But tonight I felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical amusement. Chloe and Vivian were so incredibly small. They were playing a pathetic low-stakes game of high school bullying, while I was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate execution. They thought throwing my old clothes on the grass was the ultimate display of dominance. They had no idea that the grass they were standing on, the house they were sitting in, and the very air they were breathing inside those walls were heavily leveraged against a massive balloon payment they could not even begin to comprehend, let alone pay. Vanguard Holdings held the paper on that property. They were squatting in a house they were about to be evicted from. I did not get angry. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph defending my dignity. I did not threaten them with the impending federal audits or the software revocation. I wanted them to sleep soundly tonight. I wanted them to wake up tomorrow morning feeling like absolute royalty, right up until the exact second the guillotine dropped and severed them from everything they thought they owned. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. I set the glass down on the table, picked up my phone, and opened the keyboard. My thumbs moved with calm, deliberate precision. I typed a single, chilling reply that would seal their fate and perfectly set the stage for tomorrow's absolute slaughter in the courtroom. Make sure you water the lawn. It belongs to you now. The heavy oak doors of the Suffolk County Probate Court swung open with a resounding thud that echoed down the polished marble corridor. I stepped into the courtroom with Tasha right beside me. The air conditioning was running high, making the cavernous room feel like a meat locker, which was entirely appropriate for the slaughter that was about to take place. We walked down the center aisle, our heels clicking in perfect unison against the hardwood floor. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, but my peripheral vision immediately caught the spectacle unfolding at the plaintiff's table. Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe were already seated, and they looked less like a family attending a solemn legal proceeding and more like a royal court preparing for a coronation. Vivian had chosen a blindingly bright crimson designer suit for the occasion. It was an aggressive, entirely inappropriate color for a probate hearing, screaming of new money and unearned triumph. She sat perfectly rigid, her chin tilted upward at a haughty angle, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Jamal slouched next to her, wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit that strained slightly against his shoulders. He was openly chewing gum, exuding a toxic aura of masculine entitlement. Chloe was busy tapping furiously on her phone, her wrists adorned with several thick gold bangles that clanked loudly in the quiet courtroom. As Tasha and I approached the defense table and took our seats, the whispering began. It was not the discreet, polite whispering of a courtroom. It was intentional, performative, and designed specifically for me to hear. "Look at her," Chloe hissed to Jamal, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She brought a legal pad like she is actually going to do something. I bet she took the bus here." Jamal snorted, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Let her take her little notes. After today, she is going to need a hobby. Maybe she can get a job sweeping the warehouse floors." Vivian did not turn her head, but a slow, venomous smirk stretched across her face. "Just ignore the squatter children," Vivian murmured, adjusting her diamond watch. "In about 20 minutes, she becomes completely irrelevant to this bloodline. We are taking back what is ours, and she is walking out of here with absolutely nothing." I pulled out my pen and set it precisely parallel to my legal pad. I did not glare at them. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply let their insults wash over me, feeling the cool, solid weight of the secret knowledge anchoring me to my chair. They were so busy gloating over the execution that they had completely failed to notice they were the ones with their heads resting on the chopping block. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Harrison. We all stood as a tall, imposing man with stern features and a shock of white hair took his seat behind the high wooden bench. Judge Harrison was known throughout the district for his strict adherence to procedure and his absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. He adjusted his glasses, picked up the thick manila folder containing the Vanguard Logistics estate files, and looked down at the two tables. "We are here today to finalize the probate and asset transfer for the estate of the late Isaiah Wilson." Judge Harrison began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute silence. "The court has reviewed the holographic addendum presented by the plaintiff, Vivian Wilson. The defense has submitted formal notice that they will not contest the validity of this document. Vance Vivian's highly paid corporate attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a smug air of superiority. That is correct, Your Honor. The defense has conceded. We have prepared the final transfer documents for the court's approval. These documents will formally and irrevocably transfer all controlling shares, operational authority, and physical assets of Vanguard Logistics directly to my client, Mrs. Vivian Wilson. Furthermore, the deed to the primary residential estate in Beacon Hill will be transferred into her name effective immediately upon signature. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, flipping through the dense stack of legal paperwork Vance's paralegal had handed to the clerk. He began reading the terms of the transfer aloud for the official court record. He meticulously detailed the handover of the corporate entity. He read off the registration numbers for Vanguard Logistics, citing the transfer of executive power, the release of the corporate bank accounts, and the assumption of the federal contracting licenses. He read the address of the Beacon Hill house, legally stripping my name from the property rights and handing the keys to my husband's mother. With every word the judge spoke, Vivian sat a little taller. Jamal puffed out his chest, and Chloe smirked directly at me. They thought they were listening to a catalog of their newfound wealth. They thought the judge was handing them the keys to a kingdom of endless cash flow and generational power. They heard the words Vanguard Logistics and envisioned private jets, endless shopping sprees, and total corporate dominance. What they were actually listening to was a legally binding transfer of massive, unmitigated liability. They were eagerly absorbing the operational shell. They were taking on the payroll, the tax burdens, the employee contracts, and the rigorous, unforgiving federal compliance standards required by the Department of Defense. They were inheriting the immense pressure of keeping a national logistics network running completely blind to the fact that the underlying foundation of that network had already been pulled out from under them. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table, listening to the judge place the entire crushing weight of a doomed enterprise squarely onto Vivian's lap. Judge Harrison suddenly paused his reading. The steady rhythm of his baritone voice stopped, and a thick, heavy silence filled the courtroom. He lowered the transfer documents and peered over the rim of his reading glasses, directing his piercing gaze entirely at me. Mrs. Wilson, Judge Harrison said, his tone shifting from clinical legal recitation to a deeply serious, almost paternal warning. Please stand. I stood up slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely neutral. Tasha remained seated beside me, a silent, unreadable sentinel. I have presided over this court for 2 decades, Judge Harrison continued, interlacing his fingers and leaning forward over the bench. I have seen families tear each other apart over fractions of a penny. I have seen probate battles drag on for years, draining estates dry because neither side was willing to concede an inch. And yet I am looking at a document where you, the legal spouse of the deceased, are willingly surrendering your entire marital estate without a single objection. The judge paused, letting his words sink in. He looked from me to the plaintiff's table, observing Vivian's triumphant sneer and Jamal's arrogant posture before returning his focus to me. He was a smart man. He knew something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. He knew that widows did not simply hand over multi-million-dollar corporate entities unless they were being coerced, threatened, or hopelessly outmatched. I need to make sure you fully understand the gravity of what you are doing here today, Judge Harrison said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You are not just signing a piece of paper. By executing these documents, you are legally waiving all current and future rights to Vanguard Logistics. You are walking away from a massive, highly profitable enterprise. You are surrendering a fully paid luxury residential estate in Beacon Hill. You are giving up any claim to the cash flow, the corporate assets, and the legacy of the business you helped run. He removed his glasses, his eyes boring directly into mine. Once you sign these papers, there is no turning back. You cannot change your mind next week. You cannot file a grievance next year. You are handing the entirety of your late husband's visible empire to his mother, and you are walking out of these doors with absolutely nothing. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Mrs. Wilson, you are walking away from a multi-million-dollar enterprise without a fight. To my right, Vivian let out a soft, mocking scoff. She leaned over to Vance and whispered something. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive satisfaction. She thought the judge was trying to save a drowning woman. She thought this was my final moment of pathetic humiliation, a public confirmation that I had been completely and utterly defeated. Chloe openly rolled her eyes, loudly drumming her manicured fingernails against the wooden table. Jamal snickered, leaning back and looking at the ceiling as if the judge's warning was a colossal waste of his valuable time. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived power, blinded by greed and arrogance. Beside me, Tasha sat perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not offer me a reassuring nod. She just stared straight ahead at the judge, her hands resting calmly on the thick black binder containing the Vanguard Holdings paperwork that was hidden away in my tote bag. She knew exactly what I was doing. She knew that the enterprise the judge was describing was an illusion. She knew that the fully paid estate he mentioned was actually leveraged against a massive balloon payment held by my holding company. She knew that the very second Vivian signed those papers, Tasha would stand up and serve her with breach of contract notices that would immediately bankrupt the entire operation. I looked directly back at Judge Harrison. I saw the genuine concern in his eyes. I saw a man trying to ensure that justice was not being subverted by intimidation. I appreciated his thoroughness, but he was looking at the wrong set of blueprints. He was warning me about stepping off a cliff completely unaware that I was the one holding the parachute and Vivian was the one wearing the concrete shoes. I did not break eye contact. I did not let a single ounce of my underlying satisfaction show on my face. I needed this surrender to be legally flawless. I needed the court record to show that I entered into this agreement willingly, knowingly, and without any coercion. I needed Vivian to take ownership of the poison pill without a single legal avenue for escape. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the freezing air of the courtroom fill my lungs. I thought about Isaiah. I thought about the late nights we spent building the real structure of our business, separating the assets to protect his military clearance. I thought about how much he loved his family and how profoundly they had betrayed his memory the moment he was gone. I was not walking away from a fight. I was ending the war with a single devastating strike. I looked the judge directly in the eye, my voice perfectly clear and unwavering, cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. I am absolutely sure, Your Honor. The judge held my gaze for a long, heavy moment before finally nodding. He picked up his pen and signed the bottom of the master order, the sharp scratching sound, sealing the fate of everyone in the room. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Court was adjourned. The trap was officially legally and permanently set. Vivian immediately sprang up from her chair, practically shoving Vance aside in her eagerness to reach the clerk and grab her certified copies of the transfer. Jamal and Chloe were high-fiving each other, their loud, boisterous laughter echoing off the marble walls. I did not wait around to watch their celebration. Tasha and I gathered our files and walked briskly out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy oak doors and marching down the long corridor toward the elevators. We stepped into the empty elevator car. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of Vivian's triumphant cackling. Tasha hit the button for the lobby and let out a massive tension-releasing breath. "It is done," she said, her voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. "They signed it all. Vivian just legally accepted full ownership of Vanguard Logistics. She holds all the liability. She is the sole guarantor on the federal contracts. And she is currently in violation of every single lease and software license Vanguard Logistics requires to operate," I replied, staring at my reflection in the polished metal elevator doors. "You have the eviction notices and the software revocation mandates ready." Tasha patted her leather briefcase. "I have the process server waiting in the lobby of their downtown headquarters. The moment Vivian steps out of her car to claim her new corner office, she is going to be handed a mountain of legal mandates. We are revoking their access to the dispatch software effective immediately. We are terminating the commercial warehouse leases due to unauthorized transfer of ownership. And we are calling in the balloon payment on the Beacon Hill estate." The elevator chimed and the doors opened to the bustling ground floor lobby. I walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, feeling the crisp Boston wind wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my destiny. I hailed a cab to take me back to my corporate penthouse in the Seaport district. I needed to be in front of my monitors when the logistics network officially flatlined. I settled into the back seat of the cab watching the city blur past the window. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was another text message from Chloe. They just could not help themselves. They had won the war in their minds, but they still needed to twist the knife. They needed to make sure I felt the pain of my defeat. I opened the message. It was a photograph of the Beacon Hill property. The custom landscaping Isaiah and I had spent thousands of dollars perfecting was currently covered in heavy black industrial trash bags. They had literally thrown the last of my personal belongings out onto the grass. Beneath the picture was a text. "We found your clothes in the guest room. They are on the lawn. Do not be late to court tomorrow." She must have sent the message while sitting in the courtroom, right before the judge finalized the paperwork, just to ensure I felt maximum humiliation while surrendering my assets. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to realize that I had been entirely erased from the house I had turned into a home. I stared at the picture of the trash bags sitting on the pristine green grass. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel the crushing weight of sorrow. I felt a profound, chilling sense of finality. The Beacon Hill house was a beautiful piece of architecture, but it was currently heavily mortgaged by a loan held exclusively by Vanguard Holdings. Vivian and Chloe were gloating over a property that was about to be foreclosed on the moment they failed to make the massive penalty payment triggered by the ownership transfer. I looked at the text message. I did not type out an angry paragraph demanding respect. I did not threaten them. I simply stared at the image of the lawn, thinking about the astronomical water bill required to keep that specific type of grass green. During the Boston summer, a bill Vanguard Logistics was no longer paying. I tapped the reply box. My fingers moved swiftly, typing out a single chilling response. "Make sure you water the lawn. It belongs to you now." I hit send, turned my phone on silent, and tossed it back into my purse. I leaned my head against the cool leather seat of the cab and closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the city traffic. Let them enjoy their trash bags and their stolen jewelry. Let them revel in their empty kingdom. The clock was ticking. The server access was severed, and the empire they thought they conquered was about to collapse directly on top of their heads. The morning of the final probate hearing dawned gray and bitter. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Suffolk County Courthouse, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished mahogany benches. I sat beside Tasha at the defense table, my posture perfectly rigid, my face a mask of absolute calm. We had arrived 30 minutes early. I wanted to be seated and settled when they made their grand entrance. I wanted to watch them walk into the slaughterhouse. Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe arrived exactly 2 minutes before the judge was scheduled to take the bench. They did not simply walk into the courtroom. They paraded into the room. Vivian was wearing a sharply tailored ivory suit that practically glowed in the dim lighting, a clear visual statement of her perceived purity and absolute victory. Jamal flanked her right side, wearing a smirk so wide it looked permanently etched into his jawline. Chloe trailed slightly behind, loudly typing on her phone, undoubtedly updating her social media followers about her newly acquired aristocratic status. They took their seats at the plaintiff table with exaggerated theatrical movements. Vivian adjusted her suit jacket and cast a long, lingering look of pure disdain in my direction. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply held her gaze with the serene confidence of a woman who knew exactly how the next 10 minutes were going to play out. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. The bailiff instructed us all to rise. The rustle of expensive fabric and the creak of wooden benches filled the quiet air. Judge Harrison took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the massive file sitting in front of him. He looked over the paperwork, verifying that all the necessary documents for the complete transfer of Vanguard Logistics and the Beacon Hill estate had been drafted according to the holographic codicil. The bailiff stepped forward, collecting the towering stack of transfer documents from the judge's clerk. He walked slowly across the well of the courtroom, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the floorboards. He stopped at our table and placed the massive stack of paper directly in front of me. He handed me a heavy black fountain pen. The physical weight of the documents was substantial. It was hundreds of pages of corporate registries, federal compliance transfers, property deeds, and operational handovers. It was the entire meticulously documented history of a company my late husband had built neatly bound and ready to be surrendered. Vivian could not contain her venomous excitement. She leaned across the small aisle separating our tables, invading my personal space. The cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me. "Sign it, failure," Vivian whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, but it dripped with decades of resentment and unadulterated greed. "Go ahead and sign away everything you thought you stole." I looked down at the signature line on the first page. I felt the smooth, cold barrel of the fountain pen in my hand. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. I did not feel the crushing weight of defeat that Vivian so desperately wanted to see in my eyes. Every stroke of the pen I was about to make was a tactical maneuver. I was not signing away an empire. I was signing a legally binding confession of liability and handing it directly to the enemy. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I moved with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. I signed the transfer of the corporate checking accounts, fully aware that those accounts were functionally useless without the routing software. I signed the deed to the Beacon Hill estate, knowing with absolute certainty that the massive balloon mortgage payment was due in less than 30 days and Vivian had absolutely zero capital to cover it. I signed over the federal logistics contracts, legally transferring the devastating daily non-compliance penalties directly onto her shoulders. Page after page, signature after signature, I systematically dismembered my legal connection to the sinking ship. Tasha sat beside me in perfect silence, acting as my witness, her face betraying no emotion whatsoever. When I reached the final page, I executed my signature with a sharp, definitive flourish. I capped the pen, neatly aligned the stack of documents, and slid them back across the table to the waiting bailiff. The bailiff carried the documents back to the bench. Judge Harrison picked up his heavy ink stamp. The loud, rhythmic thud of the stamp hitting the paper echoed through the courtroom, a final, irrevocable seal on the transaction. "The transfer is complete," Judge Harrison said, closing the thick manila folder and resting his hands on top of it. "The estate of Isaiah Wilson, including the entirety of Vanguard Logistics and the primary residential property, is hereby legally transferred to the plaintiff, Mrs. Vivian Wilson." Vivian stood up instantly. She did not even attempt to maintain the solemn decorum expected in a courtroom. She threw her arms open and Jamal and Chloe immediately rushed to embrace her. They pulled each other into a tight, victorious hug, their hushed squeals of delight and triumphant laughter breaking the silence of the room. Jamal aggressively patted his mother on the back, while Chloe literally jumped up and down, her heavy gold bracelets clanking wildly. They looked exactly like royalty, who had just successfully executed a ruthless coup and claimed their rightful throne. They had won. The company was theirs. The house was theirs. The money, the status, and the legacy were finally under their absolute control. Judge Harrison gathered his files and prepared to dismiss the court. Vivian turned away from her children, smoothing her ivory suit jacket, and shot me one final devastating look of absolute triumph. She opened her mouth, undoubtedly preparing to deliver a parting insult before marching out to claim her corner office. Before she could speak, before they could even take a single step toward the heavy oak doors to begin their victory parade, I stood up. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply against the floor. I did not look at Vivian. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and directed my gaze entirely at the man sitting behind the elevated bench. "Your Honor," I said. My voice was not loud, but it rang out with crystal-clear authority, slicing through the celebratory noise at the plaintiff's table like a razor blade. Judge Harrison paused, his hands resting on his files. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. Is there a procedural question regarding the finalized transfer?" "There is, Your Honor." I replied, my tone perfectly even and respectful. Just for the absolute clarity of the official court record, I need to verify a specific detail regarding the transfer of corporate ownership. Since Vivian Wilson is now the sole legal owner and majority shareholder of Vanguard Logistics, can the court explicitly confirm that she immediately assumes all attached operational liabilities, outstanding corporate debt, and federal compliance obligations? The courtroom went entirely still. The triumphant smiles on the faces of Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. They did not understand the question. They did not understand why I was asking about liabilities when they had just inherited millions of dollars in corporate assets. Judge Harrison looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly before nodding in confirmation. That is the standard legal nature of a total corporate transfer, Mrs. Wilson. When a party assumes 100% ownership of a corporate entity, they assume the company in its entirety. That includes all physical assets, intellectual property, held by that specific entity, operational contracts, and all outstanding debts and liabilities. From the exact moment this transfer was stamped, the plaintiff is fully and legally responsible for the financial and operational health of Vanguard Logistics. I let his words hang in the freezing air of the courtroom. I wanted those words permanently etched into the court reporter's transcript. I wanted absolute, undeniable proof that Vivian had willingly and legally strapped herself to the bomb. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Vivian. The arrogant, triumphant glow had completely vanished from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing with sudden, overwhelming suspicion. The gears in her mind were grinding frantically, trying to figure out where the trap was hidden. She knew me well enough to know that I never asked a question unless I already held a devastating answer. I smiled at her. It was not a polite smile. It was a genuine, terrifying smile of absolute predatory satisfaction. "That is wonderful news, Your Honor," I said, maintaining unblinking eye contact with Vivian. "Because as of 9 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Logistics is in catastrophic default." Vivian flinched as if I had struck her across the face. Jamal took a step forward, his jaw clenching. "What are you talking about, Jada?" Jamal demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "We checked the accounts. The company is generating millions." "The company generated millions when I allowed it to operate," I corrected him, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "But you do not own the operational infrastructure, Jamal. You just bought a shiny, expensive box with absolutely nothing inside it. Vanguard Logistics does not own a single commercial warehouse. It does not own the proprietary dispatch software that runs the federal contracts. It licenses those assets from an entirely separate corporate entity, an entity named Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Vivian's face drained of all color. She looked at Vance, her highly paid attorney, who suddenly looked physically ill. Vance frantically opened his briefcase, his hands shaking as he desperately searched for corporate registration documents he had completely overlooked. "And I am the sole managing member of Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center aisle. "Yesterday afternoon, you permanently revoked my administrative access to the Vanguard Logistics servers. By doing so, you explicitly violated the mandatory security protocols required by our Department of Defense contracts. Furthermore, by transferring ownership of the logistics company without the written consent of the holding company, you have triggered a mandatory breach of contract clause." I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of manila envelopes. I handed them to Tasha, who stood up and walked briskly over to the plaintiff's table. "Effective immediately," I announced, watching Vivian's eyes widen in absolute horror as Tasha placed the envelopes directly in front of her. "Vanguard Holdings, LLC is revoking all software licenses for your entire trucking fleet. Every single dispatch screen in your operation is currently black. Your trucks cannot move. Your federal shipments are stranded at the port. You are currently incurring $100,000 an hour in federal non-compliance fines. In addition, we are terminating the master leases on all 7 of your commercial warehouses due to breach of contract. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before we seize your inventory to cover the outstanding rent. Chloe let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Vivian collapsed back into her chair, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the armrests to steady herself. "Oh, and Vivian," I added, my smile widening as I looked down at her. "The Beacon Hill estate you were so eager to claim is carrying a heavily leveraged commercial balloon mortgage, a mortgage that Vanguard Holdings purchased from the bank 6 months ago. Since you have officially taken ownership of the deed, you are now personally responsible for the balance. The payment is due on Monday. I suggest you start packing those trash bags. You are going to need them." The morning of the final probate hearing dawned with a crisp, unforgiving clarity. The storm from the previous night had completely washed the Boston sky, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant blue that felt almost too bright for the solemnity of a courtroom. I dressed with the meticulous, calculated precision of a soldier preparing for a definitive battle. I bypassed the colorful, approachable wardrobe I usually favored for client meetings and selected a sharply tailored obsidian black suit. It was severe, authoritative, and offered absolutely zero emotional leverage. Tasha met me in the lobby of my building, her expression a mask of impenetrable professional focus. She carried the heavy leather briefcase containing the final Vanguard Holdings documents, the invisible guillotine waiting to drop. We did not speak during the brief car ride to the Suffolk County Courthouse. There was nothing left to say. The trap had been meticulously engineered, baited, and set. All we had to do now was watch them step inside and lock the door behind themselves. We pushed through the heavy, brass-studded oak doors of the courtroom exactly 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to commence. The air conditioning was running high, giving the cavernous room the distinct chilling atmosphere of a meat locker. It was entirely appropriate for the corporate slaughter that was about to unfold. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my chin parallel to the floor, my heels clicking in a steady, measured rhythm against the polished hardwood. My eyes remained locked straight ahead, but my peripheral vision immediately caught the spectacle holding court at the plaintiff's table. Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe had arrived early, and they were not merely occupying their seats. They were actively claiming their territory. They looked less like a grieving family attending a legal proceeding, and more like an aristocratic dynasty preparing for a televised coronation. Vivian was the undisputed centerpiece of the display. She was dressed in a striking royal purple designer suit that screamed of new money and aggressive entitlement. The color was a deliberate, arrogant choice for a probate hearing, a visual declaration of her perceived dominance. She sat perfectly upright, her posture rigid with greedy anticipation, practically vibrating with the thrill of impending victory. Jamal slouched casually beside her, wearing a bespoke suit that strained slightly against his shoulders. He exuded a toxic, suffocating aura of masculine superiority, openly checking his gold watch, as if my presence was merely a minor delay in his busy schedule. Chloe was seated on Vivian's left, her wrists heavily adorned with thick, clanking bracelets, furiously typing on her phone. She was undoubtedly broadcasting their impending triumph to anyone who would listen. As Tasha and I approached the defense table, the whispering began. It was not the discreet, polite murmuring typical of a courtroom environment. It was intentional, performative, and engineered specifically to break my composure before the judge even entered the room. "Look at her walking in here like she still owns the place," Chloe hissed to Jamal, making absolutely no effort to lower her volume. "She brought her little lawyer. I bet they are trying to figure out how to stall. She is probably terrified." Jamal let out a loud, mocking snort, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let her try to stall. It does not matter what kind of legal theatrics she attempts today. After the judge stamps this addendum, she is going to need to find a new career. Maybe I will let her scrub the loading docks if she begs." Vivian did not turn her head to acknowledge me, but a slow, venomous smirk stretched across her meticulously painted lips. "Just ignore the squatter children," Vivian murmured, her voice dripping with condescension. "In about 20 minutes, she becomes completely irrelevant to this bloodline. We are taking back everything Isaiah built, and she is walking out of these doors with the absolute nothing she brought into our family." I sat down at the defense table, pulling a clean legal pad and a silver fountain pen from my bag. I aligned them parallel to the edge of the table with deliberate, unhurried movements. I did not glare at them. I did not offer a single micro-expression of anger, sorrow, or fear. I simply allowed their insults to wash over me, insulated by the cold, heavy weight of the secret knowledge anchoring me to my chair. They were so consumed by their own arrogance, so blinded by their insatiable greed, that they completely failed to realize they were eagerly marching toward their own financial execution. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open and the bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Harrison, a man known throughout the district for his strict adherence to procedure and absolute intolerance for courtroom drama, took his seat. He adjusted his reading glasses, opened the massive, incredibly thick manila folder containing the Vanguard Logistics estate files, and looked down at the two tables with a stern, impenetrable gaze. "We are here today to finalize the probate and asset transfer for the estate of the late Isaiah Wilson." Judge Harrison began, his deep baritone voice commanding absolute silence. "The court has reviewed the holographic addendum presented by the plaintiff, Vivian Wilson. The defense has submitted formal notice that they will not contest the validity of this document. We will now proceed with the formal transfer of assets." Judge Harrison began reading the terms of the addendum aloud for the official court record. He meticulously detailed the handover of the corporate entity, reading off the registration numbers for Vanguard Logistics. He explicitly cited the transfer of all executive power, the release of the corporate banking routing numbers, and the assumption of the federal contracting licenses. He read the exact address of the Beacon Hill house, legally stripping my name from the property rights and handing the keys directly to Vivian. He listed the fleet of commercial trucks, the massive employee payroll obligations, the union contracts, and the rigorous, unforgiving federal compliance standards mandated by the Department of Defense. With every single asset the judge listed, Vivian sat a fraction of an inch taller. Jamal puffed out his chest, looking around the room as if he had personally built the logistics network from scratch. Chloe smirked directly at me, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on her face. They thought they were listening to a golden catalog of their newfound wealth. They heard the words Vanguard Logistics and envisioned private jets, unlimited corporate credit cards, and generational power. What they were actually listening to was a legally binding transfer of massive, unmitigated liability. They were eagerly absorbing a hollow operational shell. They were taking on astronomical tax burdens and payroll responsibilities, completely blind to the fact that the underlying foundation of that network had already been ripped out from under them. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table, listening with profound satisfaction as the judge placed the entire crushing weight of a doomed enterprise squarely onto Vivian's lap. Judge Harrison abruptly stopped reading. The steady, rhythmic cadence of his voice ceased, and a thick, heavy silence descended upon the courtroom. The sudden quiet was jarring, amplifying the tension in the air. He slowly closed the file, lowered the transfer documents, and peered over the rim of his reading glasses. His piercing gaze bypassed the plaintiff's table entirely and locked directly onto me. "Mrs. Wilson," Judge Harrison said, his tone shifting dramatically from clinical legal recitation to a deeply serious, almost paternal warning. "Please stand." I stood up slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and my expression entirely neutral. Tasha remained seated beside me, a silent, unreadable sentinel, holding the keys to the imminent destruction of the opposing table. "I have presided over this court for 2 decades, Judge Harrison continued, interlacing his fingers and leaning forward heavily over the bench. "I have seen families tear each other apart, fighting viciously over fractions of a penny. I have seen probate battles drag on for years, draining massive estates completely dry because neither side was willing to concede a single inch of ground. And yet, I am looking at a document where you, the legal spouse of the deceased, are willingly surrendering your entire marital estate without a single objection." The judge paused, allowing the gravity of his words to echo in the quiet room. He cast a brief assessing glance toward the plaintiff's table, taking in Vivian's triumphant sneer and Jamal's arrogant, relaxed posture before returning his intense focus exclusively to me. Judge Harrison was a highly intelligent, perceptive man. He knew something was fundamentally wrong with this scenario. He understood the basic nature of human preservation, and he knew that widows did not simply hand over highly profitable multi-million-dollar corporate entities unless they were being threatened, coerced, or hopelessly outmatched by aggressive legal tactics. I need to make sure you fully, completely understand the absolute gravity of what you are doing here today. Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave, ensuring every single syllable was recorded perfectly. You are not just signing a piece of paper to resolve a family dispute. By executing these documents, you are legally and irrevocably waiving all current and future rights to Vanguard Logistics. You are walking away from a massive, highly profitable enterprise. You are surrendering a fully paid luxury residential estate in Beacon Hill. You are giving up any claim to the cash flow, the corporate assets, and the legacy of the business you helped build and run. He removed his glasses, his eyes boring directly into mine, searching for any sign of hesitation, fear, or coercion. Once you sign these papers, there is no turning back. You cannot change your mind next week. You cannot file a grievance next year when you realize the magnitude of what you have lost. You are handing the entirety of your late husband's visible empire directly to his mother, and you are walking out of these doors with absolutely nothing. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Mrs. Wilson, you are walking away from a multi-million-dollar enterprise and a fully paid estate without a fight. To my right, Vivian let out a soft, mocking scoff. She leaned over to her attorney and whispered something behind her hand, her face twisted into a mask of pure vindictive satisfaction. She thought the judge was throwing me a lifeline that I was too weak to grab. She thought this was my final moment of pathetic public humiliation, a definitive confirmation before the court that I had been completely and utterly defeated by her superior strategy. Chloe openly rolled her eyes loudly, drumming her manicured fingernails against the wooden table, clearly annoyed that the judge was delaying their impending celebration. Jamal snickered audibly, leaning back and looking at the ceiling, as if the judge's warning was a colossal waste of his valuable time. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived power, utterly blinded by their greed and arrogance. Beside me, Tasha sat perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not offer me a reassuring nod or a comforting touch. She just stared straight ahead at the judge, her hands resting calmly on the thick black briefcase containing the Vanguard Holdings paperwork. She knew exactly what I was doing. She knew that the empire the judge was describing was a meticulously crafted illusion. She knew that the fully paid estate he mentioned was actually leveraged against a massive balloon payment currently held by my holding company. She knew that the very second Vivian signed those papers, we would unleash a cascade of breach of contract notices that would immediately and irrevocably bankrupt the entire operation. I looked directly back at Judge Harrison. I saw the genuine concern in his eyes. I saw a man trying his best to ensure that justice was not being subverted by familial intimidation. I appreciated his thoroughness, but he was looking at the wrong set of blueprints. He was warning me about stepping off a cliff, completely unaware that I was the one holding the parachute, and Vivian was the one eagerly strapping on a lead vest. I did not break eye contact. I did not let a single ounce of my underlying predatory satisfaction show on my face. I needed this surrender to be legally flawless. I needed the court record to show that I entered into this agreement willingly, knowingly, and without any coercion whatsoever. I needed Vivian to take full ownership of the poison pill without a single legal avenue for escape. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the freezing air of the courtroom fill my lungs. I thought about Isaiah. I thought about the late nights we spent building the real structure of our business, separating the assets to protect his military clearance. I thought about how profoundly his family had betrayed his memory the exact moment he was gone. I was not walking away from a fight. I was ending the war with a single devastating and entirely legal strike. I looked the judge directly in the eye, my voice perfectly clear and unwavering, cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom like a blade. I am absolutely sure, Your Honor. The most powerful lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who fail to value you. For years, the protagonist sought validation from a toxic family that thrived on tearing her down. True empowerment only began the moment she stopped seeking their approval and started investing in her own future. Blood does not dictate family. Respect and unwavering support do. Ultimately, the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's walking away to build a beautiful, fiercely independent life on your own terms. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives? Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more tales of resilience.